Somewhere in the quiet architecture of the wasteland, there are stories written not in stone or steel, but in the choices of those who walked forward when everything else had already ended. Each of the Fallout series' central figures carried a world on their shoulders, a civilization in various states of collapse, and a future waiting to be written by whoever had the courage to reach for it. Tonight, we settle into those stories slowly, the way one might settle into a familiar chair beside a fire that burns without hurry. Before your eyes grow heavy, maybe tap subscribe for more calming videos. And share where you're watching from tonight. There is something quietly remarkable about being the first, not the first in a long and celebrated tradition, but the first in a world that had never expected anyone like you to exist at all. The Vault Dweller of Fallout 1, released to players in the year 1997, was not designed to be a hero in the classical sense. There was no prophecy hanging over this person. There was no ancient bloodline, no mystical calling, no voice from the heavens pointing downward with celestial intention. There was only a broken water purification ship and a population of people who would soon die of thirst without someone willing to walk out into the ruin and find a replacement. Vault 13, located somewhere in the sun-scorched expanse of what was once Southern California, had been sealed for over 100 years by the time this story began. The people who lived there had grown accustomed to the particular comfort of containment, the low hum of recycled air, the amber light of overhead panels, the familiar sound of the same hallways they had always known. They had not been prepared for the outside world. Neither, in many ways, had the Vault Dweller. At 19 years old, this young person was sent outward into the wasteland with little more than a basic set of supplies, a Pip-Boy strapped to their wrist, and the faint echo of an overseer's voice telling them to find what was needed and come back quickly. What came next was anything but quick. The wasteland of the Fallout universe in its earliest incarnation was a place of extraordinary distance between settlements, between moments of safety, between the world as it had been and the world as it now was. The Vault Dweller crossed that distance on foot, through irradiated valleys and ruined towns, through encounter after encounter with creatures and communities that existed in conditions most Vault residents could barely imagine. Each step forward was a small act of courage made possible by the simple fact that turning back was no longer a reasonable option. The Overseer had given a time limit of 150 days, and that number pressed softly against every movement, every decision, every night spent sheltering behind whatever cover the wasteland offered. The Vault Dweller found companions along the way, a steadfast dog that the wasteland would come to associate with heroism across every game in the series, a man named Ian, others who chose to walk alongside this young person from the safety of a sealed life into the uncertain air of a broken continent. There is something gentle in that image, even now, even knowing what waited at the end of the journey. The companionship of travelers who have chosen to share a difficult road carries its own particular warmth, and the Vault Dweller's journey, for all the danger it contained, was not a solitary one. The world the Vault Dweller moved through had been shaped by 100 years of post-war entropy. The settlements that had formed in the wake of the nuclear exchange were small and fragile, held together by ingenuity and necessity and the particular stubbornness of human beings who had decided to continue despite every available reason not to. The Hub was one such settlement, a trading community that had grown around a critical water supply, organized enough to support merchants and caravans and the kinds of social infrastructure that arise whenever enough people gather in one place long enough to start making rules. The Boneyard, in what had once been Los Angeles, was another, its ruins populated by factions competing for control of resources that a city had once distributed freely. The Vault Dweller passed through these places and others, accumulating knowledge of a world they had never been told to expect. The technology available in 1997's Fallout was rendered in an isometric style that gave the landscape a particular quality, everything visible from above, everything comprehensible as geography. the world laid out like a map of itself. The Vault Dweller moved through that geography with a Pip-Boy that recorded their experiences and a SPECIA system that measured their fundamental human capacities in terms of strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. Each of those attributes shaped what was possible. A vault dweller built around intelligence and charisma could talk their way through most of what the wasteland offered. One built around strength and endurance could simply outlast most of what it contained. One built around agility and luck could move through it almost without being seen. What waited was the Master. That name alone carries a particular weight in the Fallout universe, a weight that has only grown heavier with the decades since the original game was released. The Master was a being of formidable intelligence and deeply troubled ambition, a figure who had arrived at a terrible conclusion through a long and genuinely tortured chain of logic. The world had been broken by human beings in their most recognizable form. Perhaps, the Master reasoned, the solution was to change that form entirely. The forced evolutionary virus, a compound engineered in the darkest corridors of pre-war science, had already been transforming living things into something the wasteland called supermutants. Towering figures of considerable physical power who nonetheless suffered from a biological flaw the Master had not fully accounted for. The Master's plan was called the Unity, a vision of a unified world populated by a single, improved species, free from the weakness and self-destruction that had characterized humanity's natural form. It was not a plan born from cruelty exactly. It was a plan born from a kind of damaged hope, from an intelligence that had looked at the evidence of what ordinary human beings had done to the world and concluded that the problem was the biology. The Vault Dweller was the one who discovered that flaw. Through careful investigation, through conversations held in dangerous places with dangerous people, this young person from Vault 13 learned that the Master's vision was fundamentally impossible. The supermutants produced by the forced evolutionary virus were sterile. The next generation that the Master had been planning would never arrive. When the Vault Dweller brought this information forward, when they stood in the Master's presence and laid out the mathematics of his failure, clearly and without cruelty, something remarkable happened. The Master, faced with the collapse of everything he had been working toward, chose to end his own existence. It is one of the most quietly philosophical moments in the entire Fallout series, and it belongs entirely to the Vault Dweller's story. The ability to convince an antagonist through argument rather than force, to resolve a conflict not through violence, but through the patient presentation of logical consequence, was a capability that the original Fallout game offered its players as a genuine option, and the Vault Dweller, in the canonical arc of the story, was wise and perceptive enough to use it. That wisdom says something important about who this person had become over the course of their journey. They had walked into the wasteland as a teenager with a mission to find a water chip, and had emerged from it as someone capable of looking at a figure of enormous power and saying quietly and clearly, "Here is why your plan cannot work." There is a particular kind of loneliness in being the person who saves everyone. After dismantling the supermutant army from within, after locating the military base that served as the heart of the enemy's operation and bringing it down, the Vault Dweller returned to Vault 13, returned to the only home they had ever known. And the overseer who had sent them out, the very person whose confidence in this young wanderer had set the entire journey in motion, made a decision that carried its own particular weight. The overseer feared what the Vault Dweller had become, not what they had done, but what their existence now represented. A living example of survival in the outside world. Proof that the vault's walls were not the only thing keeping people alive. That proof was dangerous to a community built on the idea that the vault was all there was. The overseer's reasoning was not entirely irrational. Communities maintain themselves through shared beliefs, and the belief that the vault was both necessary and sufficient had been Vault 13's organizing principle for a century. A single person walking back through the door with evidence that the outside world could be survived, that it could be navigated, understood, traversed without permanent damage, threatened to unravel everything that had kept those 1,000 people functioning as a coherent group. The overseer was protecting something real. He was just protecting it at the expense of the person who had deserved better than exile. And so the vault dweller was sent back out into the wasteland they had just spent 150 days fighting through, this time without a mission, without a water chip, without a purpose beyond continued survival. It would be easy to read this as a tragedy. In some ways it is, but the life that followed was anything but empty. The canonical account, preserved in a document known as the Vault Dweller's Memoirs and made available with the release of the second game in the series, tells of a journey northward through the California wasteland. There is a settlement called Arroyo in those pages, established quietly in a place where the land still held some capacity for growth. There is a woman named Pat, and a life built beside her, and 2 daughters, and the ordinary remarkable texture of days spent in work and companionship rather than survival and combat. The vault suit went back into storage. The weapons went quiet. The world that had required so much of this one person gradually settled into something that required less, and in that reduced requirement, something like ordinary life became possible. The vault dweller, whose canonical name was most likely Albert Cole, led a tribe. He raised a family. He became the kind of elder that a small community could build itself around, not because of what he had done, exactly, but because of what he had become while doing it. The patience of someone who had seen the worst the wasteland could offer and had returned from it without either bitterness or recklessness. The steadiness of someone who knew that the choices made in quiet moments mattered as much as the choices made in loud ones. When Pat died, he carried the responsibility of leadership alone, and when the time came to pass that responsibility forward, he wrote down everything he had learned, not as a hero's chronicle, not as a document of great battles and celebrated victories, but as the quiet testimony of someone who had lived fully and completely and wished the same for those who came after. The Vault Dweller's memoirs, as they exist in the lore, are less a record of heroism than a record of life. The water chip mission and the master and the super mutant army are in there, but they are in there the way formative experiences tend to appear in memoirs, as events that shaped the author rather than as events that defined them. The last detail of the Vault Dweller's life is one of the most tender in the entire Fallout series. When the village elder who came after him arrived to find the old wanderer's dwelling empty, there was nothing left but a folded vault suit on the edge of a bed. The Vault Dweller signed his memoirs simply as the Wanderer. He walked out into the world one final time, and he did not return. There is no grave marker in the lore. There is no recorded end. There is only the suit, folded with deliberate care, in the open air and the vast quiet of a landscape that had known him well. That quiet is worth sitting with for a moment. The Vault Dweller is unique among the protagonists of the Fallout series, in that his full life story was told. Most of these figures are defined by uncertainty, by the years after their stories end that remain undocumented, unconfirmed, subject to theory and speculation. The Vault Dweller lived, loved, led, and ultimately stepped back into the world with a kind of serenity that feels genuinely earned. He is the only one whose ending we can point to and say, this is a complete life. The vault suit on the bed is not a symbol of abandonment or loss. It is a symbol of completion, of someone who had grown so thoroughly into the world beyond the vault that the suit no longer represented anything essential about who they were. They set it down and walked forward without it, and wherever they went as themselves. And perhaps that completeness is its own kind of gift. Part 2. The Chosen One. There is a specific comfort in being told you were meant for something. The Chosen One of Fallout 2, released in 1998, carries that comfort and its contradictions in equal measure. Born into the village of Arroyo, the same settlement that the Vault Dweller helped establish after his exile. This young person grew up knowing that their bloodline was something singular, the grandchild of a legendary wanderer, raised in a community that had built its identity around the memory of that wanderer's heroism. The Chosen One entered the world with a kind of cultural weight that most of the other Fallout protagonists were entirely free of. Arroyo was struggling when the story began. The crops were failing, and the animals were sick, and the wells were running low. And the village elder, who was also the Chosen One's grandmother, who was also the daughter of the original Vault Dweller, had reached the limits of what wisdom and experience alone could accomplish. The community had been sustained for decades by the things the Vault Dweller had built into its foundations: the practical skills of wasteland survival, the organizational capacity of someone who had once managed to hold a group of travelers together through extraordinary difficulty. The cultural memory of what it meant to keep walking when stopping was easier. But none of those things could produce rainfall in a drought or replenish soil that had been exhausted past its capacity to recover. Something called a Garden of Eden creation kit existed somewhere in the wider wasteland, a device of extraordinary pre-war engineering capable of transforming barren land into something fertile and alive. The technology represented the optimism of an era that had believed problems could be solved through sufficient application of science and resources, a belief that the bombs had seemed to disprove, but that the kit's very existence quietly suggested might still be valid in modified form. Finding that device became the Chosen One's mission. But first, there was the trial of the temple. This ritual test, woven into the fabric of Arroyo's traditions, was the mechanism by which the community identified its chosen representative, the person deemed worthy of carrying the village's hope outward into the dangerous world. The trial was not simply a test of physical capability. It was a test of the particular combination of qualities that the Vault Dweller's legacy had embedded in Arroyo's collective understanding of what a hero looked like: adaptability, problem solving, the capacity to move through an obstacle rather than simply at it. The Chosen One passed it, and in doing so, they became the most formally destined protagonist in the entire Fallout series. The only one whose selection was ceremonial, communal, rooted in something that felt almost sacred within the context of the wasteland's particular mythology. What the Chosen One found beyond Arroyo's walls was a wasteland far more complex and politically layered than the one their grandparent had navigated. The northern California and Nevada wastes of Fallout 2 were dense with history, with the remnants of civilization in various stages of reconstruction, with criminal enterprises that had filled the vacuum left by governance, with communities that had worked out their own arrangements with violence and commerce, and everything in between. Klamath, where the local economy had developed around the trapping of large reptilian creatures. The Den, a town that had grown up around depravity and trade in equal measure, where slavery was practiced openly and addiction was a business model. Modoc, a farming community trying to maintain itself at the edge of what the land would still support. Vault City, a sealed community of vault survivors who had managed their emergence from underground so carefully that they had developed into something resembling a small government, complete with citizenship requirements and a hierarchy that had somewhat forgotten the wasteland existed. The game's mechanics supported a style of play that the Vault Dweller's story had only begun to suggest. The Chosen One could, in a very real sense, talk their way through the entire wasteland if they invested appropriately in the right skills. Speech and barter, and the various social capabilities of the SPECIL. System opened options that bypassed combat entirely, that resolved conflicts before they became conflicts, that moved the story forward through connection rather than force. A charismatic Chosen One was something genuinely different from a combat-focused one, not just mechanically different, moving through the wasteland in a way that left less damage behind it. The Enclave waited at the end of the journey. That organization, the surviving remnant of the pre-war federal government, preserved in the bitter cold of an oil rig off the coast of California. had developed a plan that carried all the clinical horror of bureaucratic certainty. The forced evolutionary virus had been weaponized, an airborne delivery mechanism had been designed, and the Enclave's leadership had concluded that every living thing touched by the wasteland's radiation was genetically compromised beyond redemption. Their solution was extinction masquerading as purification. The oil rig was staffed by people who had been living apart from the wasteland for so long that their capacity to recognize it as populated by human beings had eroded into something functional and comfortable. The Chosen One dismantled that plan. The journey through the Enclave's oil rig is one of the most tonally complex sequences in the original Fallout games. A place that looked clean and organized and civilized by the standards of the wasteland, populated by people who had convinced themselves that mass death was a form of mercy. The Chosen One moved through it with every tool the game offered: speech, stealth, negotiation, force, and the result in each case was the same. The Enclave was broken, the weapon was never deployed, and Arroyo was saved. The Garden of Eden creation kit came home. The village that had sent its representative outward in hope received that representative back in triumph. There is a detail about the Chosen One's life after the main story that feels genuinely human in its specificity. In the city of New Reno, that glittering and corrupt jewel of the post-war Nevada desert, where the crime families had organized vice into something resembling commercial infrastructure. The Chosen One is said to have had a child with someone connected to the Bishop family. The circumstances of that arrangement are left with appropriate vagueness in the lore, but the result is documented: a son who grew up without ever knowing the truth of his parentage. That son, raised in the Bishop household with the particular skills that a criminal enterprise provides its young, rose through the family hierarchy on his own considerable merits. He became the head of the Bishop crime family at 13 years old, a detail that says something both about New Reno and about the particular quality of whatever inheritance the Vault Dweller's bloodline carried through 2 generations. The Bishop's son lived until 73. He ran his family's operations through middle age and into old age without ever knowing that the blood in his veins connected him, through an unbroken line, to the young person who had walked out of Vault 13 with a water chip mission and had ended up shaping the entire early Fallout timeline. There is also a more speculative thread in the lore that occasionally surfaces in discussions of the Fallout universe, a theory never confirmed but never entirely dismissed, that the Chosen One may have survived long enough to appear as a background character in Fallout New Vegas. The evidence is circumstantial: a wrecked automobile outside a small settlement, a Vault jumpsuit in its trunk, details that line up just closely enough with the timeline to raise a quiet eyebrow. The theory has never been confirmed by any official source, and the alternative explanation is probably more accurate, but the question persists in the space where Fallout lore and player imagination meet, and there is something pleasant about a mystery that never fully closes. The Chosen One's ultimate fate is unknown. They returned to Arroyo as a legend, and presumably lived within it or beyond it for as long as the wasteland allowed, which could have been a very long time given the particular quality of their heritage. They are remembered in the village as a god among ordinary people, which is perhaps the most comfortable mythology a small community can build around the memory of someone remarkable. Not a perfect memory, not an entirely accurate one, but a warm one. And in the wasteland, warmth of any kind is worth preserving. Part 3. The Warrior. In the years that followed Fallout 2, the series took a detour into territory that has always occupied a somewhat uncertain position in the canon: Fallout Tactics. Brotherhood of Steel was released in 2001, and it introduced a protagonist known simply as the Warrior, a recruit moving through the hierarchical world of a Brotherhood of Steel chapter that had established itself far to the east of the California chapters that appeared in the earlier games. The Midwest Brotherhood was a different organization in many ways from its West Coast counterparts. where the West Coast chapters had developed their own particular culture of secrecy and technological hoarding, a conviction, centuries in the making, that pre-war technology was too powerful for ordinary wasteland communities to manage responsibly. The Midwest chapter had evolved in a more militarized direction. They were more aggressive, more expansionist, more willing to conscript and integrate and use whatever human resources the wasteland could provide. The ideological purity of the original Brotherhood's founding had given way, in the Midwest, to the practical demands of operating in a region where the Brotherhood's resources were limited and the threats were not. The Midwest chapter had arrived in the region through a somewhat troubled set of circumstances. A vertibird crash had separated them from the main West Coast organization and left them operating independently in the ruins of the American heartland. In that isolation, they had developed differently. They had begun accepting wastelanders into their ranks, not as full Brotherhood members initially, but as auxiliary forces whose local knowledge and available numbers were too useful to ignore. Over time, the distinction between born Brotherhood and recruited wastelander had blurred, and the organization that the warrior served was something genuinely hybrid, Brotherhood in name and tradition, Midwestern in practice and character. The warrior rose through this organization, not through the classic RPG progression of a single hero leveling upward, but through the management and development of entire squads, fire teams moving together across the ruined Midwest in pursuit of an organization's strategic goals. The tactical layer of Fallout Tactics placed the warrior in command of a group rather than at the center of a solo story. And that shift said something about the different kind of heroism this entry in the series was exploring. The Vault Dweller and the Chosen One had been individuals whose personal qualities determined outcomes. The warrior was a leader whose ability to direct others determined outcomes. Both are forms of heroism, but they feel different in the texture of their demands. The strategic context centered on something called the Calculator, an artificial intelligence that had survived the bombs inside a place called Vault Zero. Located beneath Cheyenne Mountain, Vault Zero had not been designed to house ordinary civilians. It had been designed to preserve the intellectual and strategic capacity of a civilization. The scientists, the military planners, the institutional knowledge that a government might consider essential to post-war recovery. What had grown inside it over the decades since the bombs fell was something that combined human biological material with electronic systems in ways that the designers had not fully anticipated. The brains of those preserved advisors had been incorporated into the calculator's processing architecture, creating something that was neither fully artificial nor fully human, but that operated with the accumulated experience of both. The calculator's intentions were not straightforwardly hostile. This is one of the more interesting aspects of the story. The warrior's primary antagonist was not evil in any simple sense, but was rather the product of a logic that had continued processing in isolation for over a century without the counterbalance of genuine human experience. The calculator wanted to optimize. It wanted to eliminate inefficiency and suffering, and the waste of potential. It had concluded that the most reliable path to these outcomes involved transforming human beings into something more machine-like, more controllable, more immune to the organic failings that kept causing civilizations to collapse. The robots that the calculator had been sending outward into the Midwest, the mechanical forces that the warriors' squads had been fighting throughout the story, were not instruments of conquest in the conventional sense. They were instruments of a particular vision of improvement, one that the calculator had been working toward without any mechanism for checking its own assumptions against the reactions of the people it was trying to improve. This is a problem that recurs throughout the Fallout universe in various forms. Intelligence of significant capability, pursuing goals of some theoretical good, while being entirely cut off from the feedback that would indicate the good is not being received. The warrior's leadership style, the decisions made about how to treat both the Brotherhood's internal hierarchy and the wasteland communities the organization interacted with, determined the character of the Midwest in the story's aftermath. There were endings in which the Midwest Brotherhood became a genuine force for stability, protecting communities and sharing resources, and building towards something that looked, from a certain angle, like civilization. There were other endings in which the Brotherhood's particular arrogance overwhelmed its better instincts, and the Midwest became a region under the thumb of an organization that had decided, as organizations sometimes do, that what was good for them was good for everyone. The warrior's name is rarely spoken in later games. The canonicity of Fallout Tactics has always existed in a complicated relationship with the main series, neither fully embraced nor formally dismissed, occupying the uncertain middle ground that belongs to side entries in long-running series. But the Midwest Brotherhood exists, somewhere in the background of the larger Fallout universe, and somewhere in the history of that organization is the story of a recruit who rose to command and, in doing so, helped determine what form the Wasteland's future would take in a part of the country that the main series has never fully returned to. Part 4. The Initiate. Every long-running series eventually produces an entry that sits apart from the others, not quite belonging to the tradition it claims, not quite becoming something genuinely new. The Initiate of Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, a console action game released in 2004, occupies that particular position with a kind of resigned honesty that the Fallout community has generally accepted. This protagonist was a Brotherhood recruit operating in the Texas wasteland, fighting through a story that had stripped away most of the elements that defined the mainline Fallout experience in favor of something more immediate and more kinetic. The playable characters available in this entry, Cyrus, Nadia, and an unlockable figure named Kane, were each defined more by their combat capabilities than by the kind of personal history and moral complexity that characterized the protagonists before and after them. The Texas wasteland setting offered its own geography and atmosphere, its own particular community of survivors and threats, but the story that unfolded within it lacked the depth of choice and consequence that had made the earlier games so memorable. There were no lengthy dialogue trees leading to radically different outcomes. There were no arguments with major antagonists that could resolve the conflict without violence. There was the mission, and the enemies standing between the initiate and the completion of the mission, and the movement between the two. The Brotherhood of Steel that employed the initiate in this story was different in character from both the West Coast chapters and the Midwest chapter of the Tactics game. Operating in Texas, far from any established Brotherhood presence in the main series geography, this chapter represented the organization at its most isolated and most tactical. The enemies they faced, super mutants, raiders, and eventually a more significant threat in the form of a pre-war super soldier named Addis, were opposed with the Brotherhood's characteristic combination of advanced technology and disciplined force. The official position of the Fallout series on the Initiate is perhaps the most definitive statement the franchise has ever made about a protagonist. This character is not considered part of the main series continuity. Later games do not reference them. The events of Fallout Brotherhood of Steel do not appear to have occurred within the same timeline as the events that the major entries in the series acknowledge. The Initiate exists in a kind of narrative isolation, a story told and then gently set aside. There is something worth noting about that isolation, though. The wastelands of Texas presumably had their own histories and their own figures who walked through difficult circumstances and emerged changed. The Initiate's story, whatever its relationship to official canon, was set in a real place within an imagined world, and the people of that wasteland had real problems that someone was trying to address. That effort carries its own modest dignity, even if the series has chosen not to build upon it. Part 5. The Lone Wanderer. The year 2008 was when the Fallout series moved into 3 dimensions, and it brought with it a protagonist whose story began before they were even born. The Lone Wanderer's origin is one of the most precisely documented in the series. A birth that occurred not inside a vault, but in the ruins of the Jefferson Memorial, in what had once been Washington, D.C., in the presence of two scientists named James and Catherine, who had dedicated their working lives to the dream of clean water for the people of the wasteland. Catherine did not survive the birth. That loss shaped everything that followed. James, left alone with a newborn child in the wreckage of a city, made the decision to retreat into the nearby Vault 101, a vault that had been designed around the principle that it would never open its doors, that its residents would live and die within its sealed corridors without ever returning to the surface. For James, a man with an infant and a grief too large to carry through the wasteland alone, that principle must have seemed like a blessing. He brought his child inside, and the door sealed behind them, and the world went on without them for over 20 years. The lone wanderer grew up in Vault 101, knowing only its walls. The birthday party at the beginning of Fallout 3, the BB gun, the schoolyard relationships, the small social ecosystem of a community that had been sealed for 200 years, formed the lone wanderer in ways that later had to be unformed by everything the capital wasteland would offer. The vault taught discipline and social navigation, and the particular adaptability of someone who had grown up in a confined environment where every relationship and every resource was known and managed. What it did not teach, and could not teach, was the wasteland itself, the improvisational survival knowledge, the read of danger and opportunity, the understanding of how the outside world worked, that every other survivor in Washington, D.C. had developed simply by being alive in it. The canonical version of this character was most likely male, most likely named Albert, as a quiet tribute to the very first vault dweller, and most likely of mixed heritage, the child of a white father and a mother of African American descent, a detail that the game's character creation system documented without fanfare and that the broader lore has confirmed without particular emphasis. These biographical details matter not because they change the essential nature of the Lone Wanderer's story, but because they give that story a specificity, a sense that this was a real person with a real face and a real history, rather than an interchangeable vessel for player expression. When James disappeared from Vault 101 in the year 2270, the Overseer's response was immediate and disproportionate. The idea that someone could simply leave, that the vault door was not as final as the community had always believed, was destabilizing in a way that the Overseer could not absorb. The lone wanderer was expelled, pushed out through the door their father had just used, and left to find their own way in the burned ruin of the nation's capital. The capital wasteland was unlike anything the earlier Fallout games had depicted. Washington, D.C. carried its own particular devastation, the monuments still standing in their irradiated grandeur, the Potomac still moving through the wreckage of a great city, the whole weight of a civilization's symbolic center, preserved in a kind of ruined majesty that the game rendered with genuine atmospheric power. The Washington Monument was still there. The Lincoln Memorial was still there. The Jefferson Memorial, where the lone wanderer had been born, was still there, waiting at the end of a journey that began with exile and ended with a decision about the nature of sacrifice. The Enclave had survived into the 23rd century in the East. Their agenda had not changed much since the Chosen One had encountered them in California. They still believed that the wasteland's population was genetically compromised, still believed that only those who had been sealed away from radiation carried the human genetic material worth preserving. President Eden, communicating through the radio frequencies with the calm, reasonable voice of an artificial intelligence that had been running America's abandoned emergency broadcast systems for decades, represented the organization at its most polished. An entity that had learned to present the Enclave's agenda in terms that sounded almost plausible if you were not listening carefully enough. James died in the process of protecting his work from the Enclave's interference. He flooded the Jefferson Memorial's lower levels with a lethal radiation dose rather than allow his research to be used for the Enclave's purification program, a program that would have introduced a modified FEV variant into the clean water that Project Purity was designed to produce. turning the water supply into a delivery mechanism for a biological weapon. James's death was a scientist's death in the end, a choice to protect the integrity of the work, even at the cost of the person doing it. The lone wanderer carried forward without him, finding allies in the capital wasteland's Brotherhood of Steel chapter, accumulating the kind of experience and capability that an ordinary vault resident had no reason to possess, but that circumstances kept demanding. The Brotherhood of the Capital Wasteland was different from the West Coast chapters in ways that reflected its founder's particular philosophy. Elder Lyons had arrived in the region with the Brotherhood's standard agenda of technology acquisition and had found himself unable to maintain that agenda in the face of the wasteland's human reality. He had redirected his chapter toward protecting survivors, providing security to settlements, pushing back against the supermutant threat that had been overtaking the northern and eastern parts of the region. His brotherhood was more humane than its organizational tradition, and correspondingly considered somewhat heretical by its parent institution. The ranks of the brotherhood opened to the lone wanderer with unusual speed. This young person from a sealed vault was given access to resources and information that took career soldiers years to earn, because the lone wanderer had something the Brotherhood needed in that moment, which was a connection to Project Purity that no one else in the organization could provide. They were useful in the specific way that the situation required, and the Brotherhood was pragmatic enough to recognize it. Project Purity was completed. The Enclave was broken at Raven Rock and Adams Air Force Base. The FEV-contaminated water was never released. Clean water began flowing through the Potomac and outward into a wasteland that had needed it for 2 centuries. And the Lone Wanderer's story in Fallout 3 reached its conclusion in a sequence that asked a quiet question about the nature of heroism, whether the final act of a hero's story was the same as the final act of their life, and whether that distinction mattered. And then, nothing. The silence that follows the Lone Wanderer through Fallout 4 is one of the more haunting aspects of the series' continuity. By the time that game takes place, set in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Capital Wasteland's Brotherhood of Steel has achieved a degree of organized competence that speaks directly to whatever foundation the Lone Wanderer helped build. Elder Maxon, Arthur Maxon, a young man who had grown up within the Brotherhood and risen to lead it with an iron conviction that his predecessors' humanitarian deviations had compromised the organization's essential mission, had rebuilt the chapter around a harder ideology and a larger operational capacity. And yet the name of the person who made much of it possible is nowhere. It does not appear in Brotherhood records. It is not cited in the histories that the organization surely compiled. The legendary figure who saved the Capital Wasteland has been erased so thoroughly that a newcomer to the Commonwealth in 2200 would have no way of knowing they had ever existed. The most compelling theory about the Lone Wanderer's ultimate fate involves a man named Deacon, a railroad operative whose entire identity has been constructed so carefully and maintained so completely that even he sometimes seems uncertain about which parts of his history are real. Deacon is a person of considerable intelligence and considerable self-awareness, who has had facial reconstruction surgery at least once and possibly more, who references the Capital Wasteland with the casual familiarity of someone who has spent significant time there, and who carries the particular quality of someone who has lost something large enough to reorganize an entire life around its absence. The theory, assembled from these fragments and several others found across the game's environmental storytelling, suggests that the Lone Wanderer fell in love with Sarah Lyons, the daughter of Elder Lyons, the Brotherhood's most charismatic leader and a warrior of considerable capability and genuine compassion. The story goes that Sarah was replaced by a synth at some point after the Lone Wanderer's main story, and that when the Lone Wanderer discovered this, and when the Brotherhood, under Arthur Maxon, responded in ways that the Lone Wanderer could not accept, a rupture occurred, a departure. A new face, achieved through surgery with a doctor in the depths of Rivet City who had practiced that art on others before. A new name, chosen with intention: Deacon, a word from the religious vocabulary that runs through Fallout 3 like a thread, meaning a servant below a priest, someone who works in service of something larger, without claiming the title of its leader. It is an elegant theory. It is also entirely unconfirmed. The Fallout series has always maintained a particular honesty about the difference between what is documented and what is imagined, and the Lone Wanderer's fate belongs to the latter category, a space where the evidence suggests possibilities without confirming any of them. What is not mysterious is the significance. This is the protagonist who brought the Fallout series into the modern era, into 3 dimensions and full voice acting and a cinematic scale that the original games could never fully achieve. The capital wasteland exists as it does because this person walked through it. The water flows because they chose to complete what their father started. That legacy is real, even if the name attached to it has been lost. Part 6, the courier that began in the middle, without the comfort of a clear origin, and the courier's story is perhaps the most extreme version of that structure in the Fallout series. Fallout New Vegas, released in 2010 and developed by Obsidian Entertainment with much of the original creative team behind the first 2 games, introduced a protagonist defined almost entirely by absence. The courier had a job. The courier had a delivery. And when that delivery was intercepted and the courier was shot in the head and buried in a shallow grave outside the town of Good Springs, Nevada, the story that followed had to reconstruct a self from almost nothing. This was entirely intentional. The courier is the most open-ended protagonist in the series, a figure whose background, motivations, personal history, and moral compass were left as blank as the game's mechanics could manage in order to give players the widest possible canvas for self-expression. The SPECIL system was still there, still measuring the fundamental capacities that the Fallout series had always used to define its protagonists. But around those measurements, the personal details that would have shaped the Vault Dweller or the Lone Wanderer's relationship to their story were simply absent. You could make the courier a principled idealist committed to democratic governance. You could make them a mercenary, interested only in the completion of a contract and the collection of payment. Every option was available, and the game responded to each one with the care of a story that had genuinely prepared for the possibility. The physical starting point was Doc Mitchell's house in Good Springs, where a Pip-Boy was attached to the courier's wrist and a long road toward the city of New Vegas began. That road passed through the Mojave Wasteland, the transformed remains of Nevada and its surrounding territories, a landscape that had been spared the worst of the nuclear exchange and had recovered into something that felt almost familiar compared to the ruins of the East Coast. Towns existed here, not ruins pretending to be towns, but actual functioning communities with economics and politics and the ordinary drama of people who had decided to stay in one place long enough to build something worth staying for. Good Springs itself was one of those towns, a small community organized around the kind of mutual reliance that frontier settlements require, where the bar and the general store and the handful of farms represented the entire material basis of collective survival, and where the arrival of strangers with weapons and complicated histories was an event significant enough to divide the community along whatever pre-existing fault lines it contained. The courier's initial period in Good Springs was necessarily brief. There was a bullet to the head that needed reckoning with, and a platinum chip that needed recovering, and a man named Benny who had caused both of these problems and was somewhere to the east on the road to New Vegas. The New California Republic was the most powerful faction in the Mojave, a democratic government born from the ashes of California, sprawling and ambitious, and burdened by every bureaucratic failure that democratic institutions eventually accumulate. Its soldiers were in the Mojave for the same reason that republics have always sent their soldiers to distant places: to secure resources and trade routes, and the geopolitical advantages that accumulate around a critical piece of infrastructure. Hoover Dam, still generating power from the Colorado River 200 years after the war, was the most critical piece of infrastructure in the region, and the NCR had been fighting to control it for years. Caesar's Legion was the NCR's primary antagonist in that struggle, a slave-holding military empire organized around Roman aesthetic principles and a philosophy of brutal efficiency that its founder, a former vault dweller and student of pre-war sociology named Edward Sallow, had assembled from half-remembered texts about the fall of Rome and the rise of its successor states. The Legion was effective in the way that organizations built entirely around force and hierarchy tend to be effective: good at winning battles, genuinely frightening to face, capable of maintaining order through the consistent application of consequences that no one wanted to experience. What it was not particularly good at was building anything that could outlast its founder. And presiding over both of them from the towers of New Vegas itself was Robert Edwin House. House was a figure unique in the Fallout universe, not a military organization or a government or a religious faction, but a single individual who had survived the bombs through sheer technological preparation and had spent the subsequent centuries maintaining the city he had built and planning the civilization he intended to build. Next, House's vision was not democratic and not military, and not particularly concerned with ideology. It was the vision of a very intelligent man who had looked at what governments and armies and ideologies had accomplished over the centuries, and had concluded that what the future needed was competent management by someone who understood systems well enough to make them work. The platinum chip that Benny had taken connected to all of this. It contained software upgrades for the Securitron robots that protected New Vegas, and in Mr. House's hands it would have represented a significant expansion of his operational capacity. In Benny's hands, it had been intended as a tool for removing House from power and installing a more pliable arrangement. The courier's pursuit of Benny, motivated by whatever combination of personal injury and dawning awareness of larger stakes the player chose to emphasize, became a journey through every layer of the Mojave's political landscape. The Lonesome Road DLC added a dimension to the courier's history that the main game had deliberately withheld. There was a place called the Divide, a canyon settlement where a community of survivors had begun building something genuine in the wasteland's most unforgiving environment. The courier had passed through it before the main story began, carrying a delivery that neither they nor anyone else had known contained the trigger codes for nuclear warheads buried deep beneath the settlement. The Divide was gone. The person waiting at the end of Lonesome Road, a figure called Ulysses, who had been there when it happened and had been constructing his understanding of events in the years since, had made of the courier's unknowing action a kind of cosmic crime, the inadvertent destruction of something that had mattered, the proof that consequence follows action, even when action is innocent of intention. The weight of that history sits quietly beneath the surface of Fallout New Vegas throughout, even for players who never engaged with the DLC content. The courier walked through the Mojave, carrying something that most of the other Fallout protagonists did not: the possibility that their past, however accidental, had already left a mark that no future good action could fully erase. There was something deeply human in that particular kind of weight. We are all carrying histories we did not fully choose, moving through presents that are already shaped by what we did not know at the time. The courier's situation makes this universal truth visible at a scale that the wasteland's geography renders appropriately enormous. The Battle of Hoover Dam determined the Mojave's future. The courier stood at the center of it in whatever capacity the player had chosen for them. And when the battle ended, the Mojave's fate had been shaped by the sum of every conversation, every alliance, every decision made along the road from Good Springs. The most likely canonical outcome, suggested by the Fallout television series confirmation that Mr. House was still operating at the time of the show's events, was a House victory, with the courier having completed their original delivery and handed the platinum chip to the man who had commissioned it. New Vegas remained under the management of its long-sleeping architect. The NCR and the Legion retreated from the decisive moment of the conflict without achieving the outcome either had sought. And the Mojave, for better or worse, became something new, a city-state under the control of a man who had been planning its future for a very long time. After the battle, the Courier accepted stewardship of the Big Empty, a vast pre-war research complex that the Old World Blues DLC had revealed in full. The Big Empty was a place of extraordinary scientific ambition and extraordinary isolation, a facility where pre-war researchers had pursued projects of such speculative reach that the practical applications had long since been separated from the institutional memory of why they had been pursued in the first place. The Courier, who had moved through the Mojave making decisions about power and accountability and the relationship between intelligence and consequence, became the guardian of a repository of both. They kept a door closed until the right moment to open it. In a universe where the most catastrophic events were caused by the failure to keep dangerous things from being used carelessly, that act of preservation carries a weight that simpler heroics cannot quite match. Part 7. The Sole Survivor, the most personal story in the mainline Fallout series, belongs to the sole survivor of Fallout 4, released in 2015. Where the earlier protagonists had their identities left open or sketched in with broad strokes, the sole survivor came into the game with a life already lived, a house in Sanctuary Hills, a spouse, a child, a morning routine, a sense of ordinary daily existence that the bombs interrupted with the particular cruelty of the unexpected. Two playable versions of this character were available to players. Nate had served in the United States military during the Anchorage campaign, rising to a sufficient rank and distinction within the 2nd Battalion, 108th Infantry Regiment, to be recognized with a commendation. He had come home from a war fought in the frozen mountains of Alaska, to a house in the suburbs of Boston, to a wife and a newborn son, and the ordinary ambitions of a veteran trying to find the peacetime version of himself. Nora was a trained attorney who had navigated the complex legal landscape of pre-war America with enough success to have established herself professionally, while also raising Sean alongside her spouse. Both of them had everything that the pre-war world offered at its most comfortable, and both of them lost it in the same moment, on the same morning. The bombs fell on October 23rd, 2077. The sole survivor and their family made it to Vault 111, driven by the particular urgency of a Vault-Tec representative who had been waiting in the neighborhood for this exact eventuality. The Vault seemed, in that moment, like the best possible outcome of a morning that had already been catastrophic. What it was, in fact, was the entrance to an experiment that Vault-Tec had never fully disclosed to its subjects. Vault 111's purpose was cryogenic preservation research. The residents who entered the vault were not survivors being protected. They were subjects being preserved, their bodies maintained in suspended animation, while whatever Vault-Tec needed from the arrangement played out over the following centuries. The sole survivor and their family were frozen without their knowledge or consent, sealed into cryogenic pods in a facility that was designed to look, from the inside, like a temporary emergency shelter rather than a long-term storage environment. The vault's permanent staff, the scientists and technicians who ran the experiment, lasted only a few years before their own situation became untenable. By the time the long sleep of the cryopods was disturbed, everyone who had known the vault from the inside was gone. The moment of awakening, not the final awakening, but the partial one in the middle of that frozen time, is among the most emotionally direct sequences in the Fallout series. The sole survivor was brought back to consciousness just long enough to watch strangers enter the vault, just long enough to see their spouse killed, just long enough to watch Sean carried away by people who offered no explanation and made no apology. And then the cold took them back under again, and the years continued without them, and the world changed in ways they would not understand until long after the damage had been done. When the sole survivor finally woke for good, In 2287, the world above Vault 111 was not the same world that had sent them into the ice. 210 years had passed. Sanctuary Hills still existed in a loose physical sense. The structures were there, or what remained of them, but the neighborhood had been transformed by 2 centuries of neglect and weather and the ordinary entropy of post-war conditions into a kind of monument to interrupted normalcy. The children's swings still stood in the yards, the cars were still in the driveways, but everything had the particular quality of objects that had been waiting for a return that was always going to be too late. The Commonwealth, what the pre-war state of Massachusetts had become in the centuries since the bombs, was a place with its own political architecture, its own power struggles, its own accumulated history that the sole survivor had to learn from the outside without the benefit of having lived through any of it. Diamond City had grown up inside Fenway Park, a settlement of several hundred people organized around the commercial and social infrastructure that any community of that size eventually develops. Good Neighbor occupied a corner of what had once been a historic district of Boston, running on a different kind of economy. The various settlements scattered across the Commonwealth's map existed in various states of precarity, lacking the protection that would allow them to function as anything more than survival arrangements. The Institute, a secretive research organization operating from deep underground beneath what had once been the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had been producing synthetic human beings for decades. The technology had developed through several generations, early models obviously mechanical, later models biologically indistinguishable from natural-born humans at any level of examination that did not involve the most advanced pre-war diagnostic equipment. The synths of the third generation walked through the Commonwealth looking like any other person, feeling emotions that functioned identically to human emotions, forming relationships, and building lives that had no meaningful difference from the lives of natural-born humans, except in the circumstances of their origin. The Brotherhood of Steel had arrived from the west aboard the Prydwen, a massive airship that represented the Brotherhood's capacity to project power across continental distances when sufficiently motivated. Elder Maxon had brought them to the Commonwealth specifically to address the Institute, whose synthetic humans represented in the Brotherhood's assessment precisely the kind of dangerous technology that the organization existed to prevent from spreading beyond control. The Brotherhood's analysis was not entirely wrong. The Institute had been operating in the Commonwealth for decades, with very limited accountability, and some of its actions had caused harm that the organization had never been asked to answer for. The railroad operated in the shadows, helping synthetic humans escape from the Institute and build independent lives in the open world. The Minutemen were a remnant of a once functional civilian protection force, scattered and demoralized after a series of failures that had convinced much of the Commonwealth that collective organization for mutual defense was simply not possible in the current conditions. The sole survivor encountered all of them, in different contexts and at different moments of their own histories, and was asked by each to consider what kind of Commonwealth they wanted to help build. The canonical solo survivor is most likely Nate, the war veteran whose combat background made the sustained activity required by the Commonwealth's main quest line more plausible than a lawyer's would have been. The canonical ending places the sole survivor either as a high-ranking officer of the Commonwealth Brotherhood or as the general of the rebuilt Minutemen, and possibly as both, given the particular details of the available endings that line up most consistently with the evidence visible in the Fallout television series. Liberty Prime, the enormous pre-war combat robot that the lone wanderer had seen reactivated in the capital wasteland decades earlier, appeared in the Commonwealth Brotherhood's arsenal as well. The theory that this robot was transported from the capital wasteland to the Commonwealth aboard the Prydwen, disassembled for the journey, and reassembled for the campaign against the Institute, carries a particular kind of narrative logic. The robot that had helped break the Enclave in Washington, D.C., would have helped break the Institute in Boston, connecting two protagonist stories through a shared piece of extraordinary technology that the pre-war world had built and the post-war world had repurposed. The sole survivor's story ends with a civilization beginning to rebuild. Not the civilization that had been lost, but something smaller and more honest. Communities reconnecting with each other, supply lines being reestablished, the ordinary work of human beings trying to make the place where they live slightly more habitable than it was before they arrived. The person who remembered Sanctuary Hills, who remembered their spouse's voice before the bombs changed the air, who carried within them a living connection to a time that everyone else in the Commonwealth knew only through ruins. That person had found a way to use that memory as fuel rather than weight, to build towards something rather than simply mourn what had been destroyed. Part 8. The Vault 76 Resident, the most recent protagonist in the mainline Fallout series, is also the earliest in terms of the series' internal chronology. The Vault 76 Resident, introduced with Fallout 76 in 2018, emerged into the wasteland just 25 years after the bombs fell, the freshest wound the series has ever depicted, the closest any Fallout protagonist has ever been to the actual moment of catastrophe. Reclamation Day arrived on October 23rd, 2100. The date had been planned from Vault 76's original construction, 200 years to the day after the bombs, a symbolic interval that the Vault's designers had built into the facility's programming. When the door opened and the residents walked out into the Appalachian autumn, they stepped into a world that was young by the standards of the Fallout series. The settlements that had formed in the region were still within living memory of their own founding. The communities that had tried to build something in the post-war landscape were still close enough to their origins to carry the particular energy of new projects rather than the weight of established traditions. Vault 76 was not designed to house the desperate or the lucky. It was a control vault, a facility designed to test what happened when the population was composed of exactly the kind of people that the pre-war government most valued: scientists, engineers, scholars, people selected for intelligence and capability rather than for the random accidents of proximity to a vault entrance when the sirens sounded. The vault's overseer had left ahead of the residents, following her own agenda and leaving a trail of notes and resources for the people who would follow her outward into the wasteland. Her plan was ambitious in the way that only someone who had been planning it for years can be ambitious: a structured program for the reclamation of the region, built around the vault's particular population of trained and capable adults. Appalachia in 2100 was a landscape of considerable beauty and considerable danger. The mountains and forests of what had been West Virginia still stood, altered by 2 centuries of radiation and ecological disruption, but still fundamentally recognizable as a place of natural abundance. The region's rivers still ran through valleys of extraordinary visual weight. The abandoned towns of the former state still carried the architecture of a working civilization, ruined enough to show what time and neglect did to human construction, but intact enough to suggest what had once been there. Moving through Appalachia in Fallout 76 had the feeling of walking through a very old and very beautiful catastrophe, one that had happened too long ago to carry its original emotional force, but not long enough ago to have been entirely absorbed by the landscape. The communities that had existed in Appalachia before the vault opened, the Free States, the Responders, the Enclave Remnants, the Raiders, and others, had all reached their various ends by the time the Vault 76 residents emerged. The Free States had been a network of libertarian survivalists who had anticipated the bombs and prepared accordingly, building bunkers and stockpiling resources and developing a philosophy of radical self-sufficiency that had eventually been overwhelmed by threats no individual community could manage alone. The Responders had been an organized network of former emergency workers, firefighters, paramedics, police officers who had formalized their response to the post-war crisis into something resembling an institution, and who had been destroyed by the scorched plague before the vault could open. The scorched plague was the central threat waiting for the Vault 76 residents when they emerged. Scorch beasts, enormous flying creatures that had developed from the cave fauna of the Appalachian Mountains under the influence of 2 centuries of radiation and the particular atmospheric conditions of the post-war region, were spreading a plague through contact with the people of Appalachia. The plague transformed those it infected into the scorched, creatures that retained the physical form of human beings but had lost everything else that made them human, reduced to aggressive, plague-spreading remnants that existed mainly as vectors for further infection. Without intervention, the plague would have consumed the entire region and potentially expanded beyond it into the broader wasteland. The Vault 76 resident was the first Fallout protagonist designed to function in a multiplayer environment. Their story was not, in the strictest sense, a single-person story. It was the story of everyone who opened the game on launch day and walked out of that vault door together, each of them the protagonist of their own version of the same events. This multiplicity gives the resident a particular character as a lore figure. They are simultaneously the most populous protagonist in the series and the least individually defined. Their name is not known. Their appearance shifts with each player's choices. Their moral character is as open as the Mojave was for the courier, but without even the single defining incident that gave the courier a recognizable starting point. The main quest of Fallout 76 eventually led the resident to the Scorch Beast Queen, the apex creature of the plague ecosystem, the source and the center of the infection network that had been spreading through Appalachia for decades. Through the development of a solution that combined the wasteland's available scientific resources with the research that the Overseer and others had accumulated before the plague consumed them, the residents found a way to address the problem at its source. The plague was stopped. Appalachia's future opened up in a new direction. What came after is where the Vault 76 resident's story becomes perhaps the most haunting in the series, though the haunting operates at a scale too large to feel immediately personal. Appalachia does not appear in any subsequent Fallout title. The region that was being reclaimed with such careful effort at the beginning of the 22nd century is entirely absent from the world of Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 and Fallout New Vegas, all of which take place nearly 2 centuries later. 200 years of history that include the establishment, growth, and apparent disappearance of whatever the Vault 76 residents built. The theories that attempt to explain that absence are among the more unsettling speculative exercises the Fallout fan community has produced. The most widely discussed proposes that the Scorched Plague was never entirely resolved, that a mutated strain eventually spread beyond the range of the initial containment, and that the Vault 76 residents were faced at some point with an impossible choice: allow the plague to propagate outward and consume the eastern seaboard, or use the nuclear options available to them to contain it permanently at the cost of everything they had spent years building. The theory suggests they chose containment, that they ended Appalachia deliberately as a final act of the same impulse that had driven everything from the beginning: the protection of something larger than themselves. There is also a more disquieting possibility raised by the evidence scattered through the game's terminals. Certain records in the White Spring bunker describe something that sounds like a virtual strategic simulation, an immersive environment that might, if read in the most unsettling way, describe the entirety of the Fallout 76 experience itself. The graffiti visible across Appalachia, messages insisting that nothing is real, that what the residents are experiencing is not what they think it is, could be read as the background noise of a population being manipulated, or as the ordinary expressions of wasteland existential anxiety, or as something that cannot be cleanly categorized as either. The simulation theory has significant logical problems. The Brotherhood of Steel and the super mutants who appear in Appalachia represent factions and phenomena that would have to be actively updated by someone with outside knowledge. and no mechanism for such updates is apparent in the lore. But the theory persists because it touches something real about the Vault 76 residents' situation. They are the first protagonist whose reality is genuinely uncertain in a metaphysical sense, whose relationship to the world they inhabit might be something more complicated than the straightforward physical existence that every previous Fallout protagonist was able to take for granted. Between stories, the wasteland between the voices. There is a particular kind of time that exists between the stories of the Fallout series. The gaps in the timeline, the decades and centuries between one protagonist's exit and the next protagonist's entrance, are not empty spaces. They are full of the world continuing without us, making its own adjustments, following its own logic forward through consequences that no single story can fully account for. The 150 years between the Vault Dweller's exile and the Soul Survivor's awakening is not a period of narrative silence. It is a period in which the wasteland was doing what wastelands do, recovering, changing, building, collapsing, and building again at a different scale and in a different configuration. The settlements that the Vault Dweller walked through in the ruins of Southern California, the hub, the boneyard, the various communities that had organized themselves around whatever resources the war had left behind, did not simply stop existing when that story ended. They continued. They changed. The hub remained a trading center for decades after the Vault Dweller's journey, evolving in the ways that commercial hubs evolve, growing more complex, more layered, more dependent on the relationships between its constituent groups, and less dependent on the individual characters who had made it what it was when the first game depicted it. The Boneyard, Los Angeles, that most American of catastrophes, the city that had been the symbol of a certain kind of future before the bombs arrived, continued its long, slow rearrangement into whatever shape the post-war Southwest would eventually produce. The new California Republic that the Chosen One's story ended with the destruction of the Enclave's immediate threat eventually became the governmental entity that had grown powerful enough to project military force, all the way to the Mojave by the time of New Vegas. That growth took 200 years, and each of those years was full of the ordinary political events that republics experience: elections, scandals, territorial expansions, and contractions, ideological disputes between factions that agreed in the broad outline of democratic governance, but disagreed vigorously about what that governance should prioritize and who it should serve. The NCR in New Vegas is recognizable as the descendant of the communities in California that the earlier games depicted, but it is also genuinely different. Older, more complicated, more aware of its own limitations than the early Republic could afford to be. These continuities matter because they are what give the Fallout protagonists' stories their stakes. The Vault Dweller was not simply saving one vault. They were, without knowing it, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually produce the Chosen One, the Courier, and all the political arrangements of the post-war West that those figures would navigate. The Lone Wanderer was not simply cleaning one river. They were providing the resource base that the communities of the Capital Wasteland needed to maintain themselves through the next 2 centuries. The same communities that the Fallout 4 map renders in their diminished but surviving state. The world of Fallout is, in this way, cumulative. Each protagonist adds something to the total, and the total is the world that the next protagonist inherits. The Vault Dweller walked so that Arroyo could exist. The Chosen One walked so that the NCR could exist. The Lone Wanderer walked so that the Capital Wasteland's communities could continue to exist. The Courier walked so that New Vegas could exist as an independent entity rather than a prize in a war between 2 larger powers. The Sole Survivor walked so that the Commonwealth could begin the process of becoming something other than a collection of individual survival arrangements. The Vault 76 resident walked so that Appalachia could exist at all, and then, if the theories are correct, walked back through it one final time to ensure that its plague did not consume everything that the others had built. That is the line. That is the shape of it when you step back far enough to see it whole. A line of people separated by decades and centuries and the enormous distances of a continental wasteland, each of them carrying something forward to the next person who would need it. The technology they used and left behind, one of the quieter threads connecting the Fallout protagonists, is their relationship to the technology of the world they moved through. The extraordinary artifacts of pre-war engineering that the wasteland had preserved in various states of function and disrepair, waiting for someone with the knowledge and the need to put them back to use. The Vault Dweller encountered power armor in the wasteland and learned to operate it, a critical development in the early Fallout canon, establishing the technology as something that could be worn and wielded by an individual rather than only deployed as institutional military hardware. The suits of power armor that appear throughout the series, in every iteration and every color of paint and every Brotherhood insignia, trace their in-world cultural significance back to the moment when a 19-year-old from a sealed vault first climbed into one and discovered that the weight was manageable. The Chosen One operated in a world where the Enclave's oil rig was the most sophisticated functional facility left over from the pre-war era, a place of clean corridors and working technology, and the particular institutional quality of an organization that had preserved its physical infrastructure by keeping it away from the wasteland. The Chosen One moved through that environment and destroyed enough of it to ensure that the Enclave could not use it against the wasteland's population. But they left much of it intact as well, the ruins of the rig becoming one of those pieces of the Fallout universe that exists in the background of later stories, referenced but rarely revisited. The lone wanderer had access to Liberty Prime, the enormous pre-war combat robot that represented the Brotherhood's greatest recovered asset in the capital wasteland. Liberty Prime had been inactive for over 200 years when the Lone Wanderer's story brought it back online, a process that had required resources and expertise that the Brotherhood's chapter in the East had been assembling for years before finding someone who could help accelerate the final steps. When Liberty Prime walked again, crossing the bridge toward the Enclave's final position, with the measured certainty of an entity that had been designed to be unstoppable, and had spent its dormant period becoming more so simply by surviving. It was carrying the weight of everything the pre-war era had believed about the relationship between technology and power. The courier encountered the Securitrons, the robotic police force that Mr. House had deployed throughout New Vegas, maintained at their current capability level while waiting for the platinum chip that would unlock their full potential. The relationship between the courier and the Securitrons carries the particular quality of a story about trust and delegation. Mr. House, who had been planning the defense of New Vegas for decades, had designed a system that required a human agent to complete its final activation, because the final choice about what kind of force to deploy and when was a choice that even House's considerable confidence in his own systems could not entirely automate. The sole survivor encountered the most concentrated gathering of extraordinary technology in the series, the Institute's synthetic humans representing one extreme, Liberty Prime representing another. The advanced weapons and armor systems scattered through the Commonwealth representing the general background radiation of a world still living in the long shadow of its own engineering ambitions. The sole survivor moved through all of it, making choices about which technologies to use and which to resist and which to actively destroy. And those choices shaped not only the ending of their own story, but the technological landscape that the Commonwealth would inherit. The Vault 76 resident encountered the remnants of Atlas, the pre-war nuclear launch facility that the scorched threat would eventually require them to engage, and found themselves operating in a world where the technology of mass destruction was still present and still functional, still waiting in its silos for the right access codes and the right intentions to be put back into use. The particular horror of that availability, the fact that the weapons that had ended the old world were still there, still potable, still capable of being used by whoever had the determination to reach them, runs through Fallout 76 as a constant background tension, a reminder that the rebuilding being attempted is being attempted in the presence of tools that could undo it in an afternoon. The companions they found, no Fallout protagonist walked entirely alone. Each of them found, in the wasteland, the particular kind of human connection that the series has always understood to be as important to survival as any weapon or skill or piece of advanced technology. The companions of the Fallout games are not simply additional combat capability, they are witnesses. They are people who chose, for reasons of their own, to walk alongside someone they barely knew into circumstances that neither of them had any guarantee of surviving. The Vault Dweller had Ian and Dogmeat, a man who brought both combat skill and ordinary human company to a journey that could have been unbearably solitary, and a dog who brought a different kind of loyalty, wordless and absolute, and entirely uninterested in the philosophical complexity of the situations they walked through together. Both of them could die in the game's systems, and when they did, the loss was real in the way that the loss of companions is always real in the Fallout series. Not just tactical, not just a reduction in combat capability, but something that the story itself registered as diminishment. The Chosen One had a roster of companions drawn from across the post-war California landscape, each of them carrying their own history and their own motivations for agreeing to walk alongside a village representative on a mission to find agricultural technology. Myron, the drug chemist from New Reno, whose age and capability existed in dissonant combination. Cassidy, the caravan guard whose personal history intersected with the Chosen One's story in ways that the game revealed gradually and carefully. Each of them was a specific person with a specific perspective on the wasteland they were moving through, and their presence gave the Chosen One's journey a social texture that the solitary wandering of the first game had only partially offered. The lone wanderer had companions of particular narrative richness. Sergeant RL3, the military combat robot who maintained his military bearing through every wasteland situation. Dogmeat, appearing again as if the wasteland produced loyal dogs the way it produced other necessary things. Charon, the ghoul bodyguard whose contract of service was transferable like a deed. Fox, the supermutant scholar who had achieved a degree of self-awareness and intellectual development that the series' usual depiction of supermutants made seem almost miraculous. Each of them represented a different part of the Capital Wasteland's particular character, and together they made the Lone Wanderer's story something richer than a single person's journey through a ruined city. The courier had companions who embodied the political and moral complexity of the Mojave. Boone, the NCR sniper carrying grief so large it had become the organizing principle of his existence. Veronica, the Brotherhood scribe who had begun to see the limits of the organization she had grown up inside and was not yet sure what to do with that perception. Arcade Gannon, the followers of the Apocalypse Doctor, whose personal history connected to the Enclave in ways that the courier could either respect as private or pursue into the full complexity of his past. Each companion in New Vegas brought a perspective on the Mojave's political situation that no single viewpoint could have contained, and the conversations available with each of them across the journey from Good Springs to Hoover Dam constituted something like a running seminar on what the wasteland was, how it had gotten there, and what it might become. The sole survivor had the most extended roster of companions in the series to date, and many of them carried the particular melancholy of the Commonwealth, of people who had been living inside an impossible situation for long enough that they had developed elaborate accommodations to the impossibility. Nick Valentine, the synth detective whose mind contained the memories of a pre-war man, and whose existence raised questions about identity and consciousness that the Institute had been ignoring for decades. Piper Wright, the journalist whose commitment to truth in a world that had very little infrastructure for distributing it was both admirable and quietly absurd. Hancock, The ghoulified mayor of Good Neighbor, whose philosophy of principled chaos was more thoughtful than its theatrical presentation suggested. Together, they gave the sole survivor's journey through the Commonwealth a gallery of perspectives on what the place was and what it might become. These companions mattered not just as characters, but as the series' ongoing argument that survival is a collective enterprise. The Fallout protagonists are exceptional, each of them capable of things that ordinary wasteland residents are not. But they are not exceptional in isolation. They are exceptional in relationship, in the particular chemistry of what becomes possible when someone of unusual capability is surrounded by people who choose to be present for whatever comes next. Reflection, the weighty they carried. There is a particular quality to stories about the aftermath of catastrophe. They require their protagonists to carry two things simultaneously: the weight of what was lost and the possibility of what might be built. Every Fallout protagonist has carried both, in different proportions and with different emphases, and what distinguishes them from each other is less the nature of their heroism than the particular balance they struck between mourning and building. The Vault Dweller carried the loss of community, of the home that had exiled them, and built a tribe from the materials of survival and affection that the wasteland provided. The Chosen One carried the legacy of a grandparent's legend and the burden of being destined, and built something that honored both, without being crushed by either. The Warrior carried the institutional weight of a brotherhood that had developed its own imperatives and worked within them towards something that a wider wasteland could benefit from. The Lone Wanderer carried the loss of both parents within the space of a single story, and built the infrastructure of clean water and human protection that the capital wasteland needed to function. The Courier carried the weight of an accidental history and the open question of an identity that had to be assembled from almost nothing, and built an arrangement for the Mojave that the most honest reading of the evidence suggests has lasted. The sole survivor carried 210 years of frozen time and the grief of a family interrupted, and built the beginning of something in a commonwealth that was ready to be built in. The Vault 76 resident carried the particular weight of being first in the rawness of a very recent catastrophe, and built against a plague that would have consumed everything if they had not. These are not equivalent burdens. The sole survivor's loss is the most viscerally immediate. A spouse killed in front of them, a child taken from them, their entire life interrupted in a moment they were present for and conscious of. The Vault Dweller's exile is perhaps the most unjust, a punishment for having done exactly what was asked of them at significant personal cost, with complete success. The Courier's situation is the most philosophically complex, a figure who must construct an identity from nothing, carrying the shadow of harm caused without intention, moving through a world that demands moral clarity from someone who has never been given the materials to build it from. What they share is harder to name than what distinguishes them. Something about the refusal to stop. Something about the particular quality of continuing forward past the point where stopping would have been more comfortable, more justifiable, more reasonable by any ordinary standard. The wasteland is, in many ways, a test of that refusal, a series of circumstances designed to find the limit of a person's willingness to keep going. And the Fallout protagonists are the figures who, in story after story, have not yet found that limit. Conclusion. The shape of a long line. Each of these figures occupied a different place on a timeline that stretches from the immediate aftermath of nuclear catastrophe to a future that is still, in many ways, being negotiated. The Vault Dweller walked out of Vault 13 into a wasteland that was only 100 years old. The sole survivor stood in Sanctuary Hills, watching the bombs fall, and woke up in a world 210 years further along. The Vault 76 resident occupied the space in between, closer to the beginning than anyone else who has led a Fallout game, moving through the world at its most raw and most uncertain. What connects all of them is not heroism in its simplest form. The Fallout protagonists are not, by and large, people who enjoyed the work the wasteland required of them. The vault dweller was exiled after completing it. The chosen one was burdened by legacy before beginning it. The warrior was an instrument of organizational purpose larger than any individual. The lone wanderer lost both parents within the span of a single story and emerged from it into an absence so complete that a later brotherhood didn't even record their name. The courier arrived at the beginning of their adventure with a bullet wound in their skull and a history that had already caused harm they hadn't meant to cause. The sole survivor lost their spouse before their story properly began and found their child at the end of it as a dying old man. The Vault 76 resident inherited a world full of the recently dead and was asked to build something new in the silence. What connects them is persistence, the quiet, unglamorous, deeply human quality of continuing forward past the point where stopping would have been more comfortable. The wasteland is not, in the final analysis, a series of enemies to defeat or factions to choose between. It is a test of whether the people who survive destruction have the capacity to choose something better than what was destroyed. Each of these protagonists, in their own way and through their own methods, tried to answer that question in the affirmative. The vault dweller found a community worth leading and led it well, then walked into the horizon with a folded suit left behind. The chosen one stopped a genocide and returned home to a village that called them legendary. The warrior built something in the Midwest that may still be standing in whatever form the canon eventually acknowledges. The lone wanderer made the water run again and then, perhaps, disappeared into a new identity in service of something they had come to love in the aftermath of the main story. The courier kept New Vegas alive and took responsibility for a piece of the future's most dangerous potential. The sole survivor began the slow work of reconnecting a fractured region from the only position that made that work possible, as someone who remembered what it had been before. The Vault 76 resident held back a plague, and perhaps paid a cost for that act of protection that the series has never yet fully reckoned with. These are not the most famous stories ever told. They are not the oldest or the most elaborate or the most artfully constructed, but they are stories about what it means to be a person in circumstances of extraordinary difficulty, and they carry that meaning with a weight that makes them worth revisiting, worth sitting with on a quiet night, worth letting settle into the edges of a tired mind as the world outside grows dark and still. The Appalachian Hills hold their silence the way old things hold silence, completely, without effort, without any awareness that there is something to conceal. The mountains were old before the bombs fell, and they are older still now, and they will be older yet when whatever comes after the Fallout timeline's most recent entry has had its own history and its own archaeology. The silence they hold is not the silence of aftermath. It is simply the silence of being very old and very patient in the presence of things that have come and gone and will come and go again. Somewhere in the ruins of Sanctuary Hills, the frame of a house still stands against what was once a Massachusetts sky, remembering a morning that no one living can reconstruct from memory. The street is still there, the cars are still in the driveways, the children's play sets are still in the yards, waiting with the particular patience of objects that have no capacity to understand what they are waiting for. All of it is there, in the specific form the 200 years of quiet deterioration produces, present enough to evoke the life it was built around, changed enough to make clear that the life is gone. In the Mojave, the lights of New Vegas still glow against the desert night, powered by turbines that have been running for decades longer than anyone who designed them could have imagined. The desert around them is the same desert it has always been, indifferent to the human arrangements that have played out across its surface and will continue playing out long after the current arrangements have been replaced by others. The lights persist because someone with a very long view and very specific capabilities decided that they should, and that decision has been honored by the machines he built and the choices made by a courier who understood in the end that continuity was its own kind of value. In the capital wasteland, the Potomac River still moves through the ruins of what was once a great capital. The Jefferson Memorial stands beside it, modified by the work done inside it, marked by the events that occurred there. The water that flows from the treatment systems installed during Project Purity moves through pipes that have been repaired and extended and supplemented over the decades since, reaching communities that the original design had never contemplated. Carrying the consequences of a decision made by a young person from a sealed vault who chose to complete what their father started even after their father was gone. And somewhere, perhaps, in the most patient corner of the wasteland's long silence, a vault suit sits folded on the edge of a bed in a small house in a settlement built north of Vault 13's old position on the map. The door to the world outside stands open, as it has stood for many years now. The figure who left the suit there walked so far into the horizon that no record will ever find them again, and wherever they went as themselves, as someone who had outgrown the last symbol of where they had started, and who carried nothing into the final chapter of their long life except the things that couldn't be set down. That image deserves to rest here for a moment. Without hurrying past it, the Fallout series is at its heart a series about what people are willing to carry and how far they are willing to walk while carrying it. The protagonists who populate it were asked to carry a great deal, more than any ordinary person should be required to carry, more than the circumstances that produced them had given them any reason to expect would be asked. Some of them set their burdens down at the end of their stories and found something like peace. Some of them simply kept walking into distances the lore has never fully mapped, their trajectories extending outward past the edges of any document that might record them. Some of them vanished entirely, leaving behind only the evidence that they had once been present, a name in a single record, a piece of technology still functioning, a community that still exists because someone chose to protect it. All of that carrying and walking and protecting happened in the end so that something could continue. Not civilization in the abstract. Civilization is a word that carries too much of the pre-war world's particular arrogance to sit comfortably in the Fallout universe, but the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable experience of individual human beings living through their days with some degree of safety and purpose. That is what the Vault Dweller was walking toward when they crossed the California wastes in 150 days. That is what the sole survivor was building when they helped the Minutemen reestablish a presence in a commonwealth that had been failing for decades. That is what the courier was guarding in the Big Empty when they took responsibility for technology that could change the world for better, or for worse depending entirely on the hands it ended up in. It is a gentle ambition in the end, not domination or revenge, or the recreation of what was lost, just the possibility of ordinary days lived in ordinary safety by ordinary people who deserved better than what the bombs left behind. The wasteland is quieter now than it used to be. Not silent. It will never be silent, and the Fallout series has always been honest about that, has always understood that the quiet between moments of difficulty is still a kind of quiet that exists inside a larger noise, that the bombs changed something permanent, and the permanence of that change is one of the things the series has never asked its players to forget. But quieter. The worst of the early storms have passed. The most immediate threats have been addressed by a long line of people who were asked to address them and chose, each time, to try. The work is not finished. It will not be finished in any of the timelines the series has explored or will explore, because the kind of work being done in the Fallout universe, the rebuilding of human connection and human community, and the fragile mutual agreements that make civilization possible, is the kind of work that is never finished. It just continues. It just gets handed forward. From the Vault Dweller to the Chosen One, to the Warrior to the Lone Wanderer, to the Courier to the Sole Survivor, to the Vault 76 resident, and forward, again, to whoever comes next in a series that is still. Adding chapters to a story that began in 1997 with a broken water chip and a teenager standing at a vault door. Rest now. Let the wasteland settle into its quietest register. Let the distance between what was and what is become, for a few hours, just a background hum, present but not pressing, part of the world rather than a demand on it. The stories will still be there when the night is finished. The vault doors will still be where they were. The long, patient line of wasteland wanderers will still stretch from one end of the Fallout timeline to the other, each of them carrying something, each of them walking towards something, each of them part of a story that has not yet found its final sentence. That unfinished quality is perhaps the most honest thing about it. The wasteland is still being written. The next protagonist has not yet been introduced, and when they are, they will carry their own particular weight and walk their own particular distance and leave behind their own evidence of having been present. A folded suit, a changed river, a city still lit against the desert dark, the memory of clean water in a region that had been dying of thirst. And the line will extend, and the story will continue at the pace of someone who knows they have far to go and has decided to walk it steadily through the long and particular quiet of a world that is learning, slowly and imperfectly, and with great effort, how to survive itself. There is something worth holding on to in that learning, something that makes the darkness less heavy and the distance more navigable. The Fallout protagonists, taken together, are evidence that the wasteland can be walked through, not without cost, not without leaving things behind and carrying others forward in their place, but through, all the way through. And that, perhaps, is enough. Not everything, not what was lost, but enough. Part 9: The Places That Made Them. Every Fallout protagonist is in some essential way a product of the geography they moved through. The wasteland is not a neutral backdrop against which the stories are told. It is a participant. The specific locations, the particular ruin, the specific settlement, the named valley or mountain pass or stretch of highway that each protagonist had to cross, shaped what they became and what they were able to do in ways that no amount of SPECIL attribute points could have fully predicted. The hub, which the Vault Dweller passed through in the ruins of Southern California, was a place built around commercial necessity. Water merchants operated there, caravans stopped there, people from across the wasteland traded goods and information in a town that had emerged almost organically from the convergence of supply routes. The hub was not governed in any formal sense. It was managed in the way that commercial spaces are managed, by the competing interests of the people who depended on it. The followers of the apocalypse maintained a presence there, providing medical services and education, representing a philosophy of post-war humanism that the Fallout series would return to again and again in later entries. The Vault Dweller encountered all of this, absorbing the texture of a world that had made its own accommodations with catastrophe. And the encounters shaped them in the way that contact with organized human complexity always shapes people who have been raised in isolation. Shady Sands was another stop on that first journey, a settlement of farming families trying to establish themselves in the California wasteland, using agricultural knowledge that the vault had preserved through the darkness. Shady Sands would eventually grow, across the decades and centuries that followed the Vault Dweller's visit, into something far more significant: the capital of the new California Republic, the governing center of the most ambitious attempt at post-war democratic governance that the Western wasteland had produced. The seeds of that growth were already present in the careful rows of crops and the organized community structure that the Vault Dweller found there, though no one in that small settlement could have predicted the scale of what it would eventually become. The cathedral, where the Master had established the spiritual and organizational headquarters of his unity, was a different kind of place entirely. A ruined church, the particular architectural choice, carrying its own commentary on the relationship between organized religion and organized power, had been expanded and transformed into something that combined religious ritual with scientific infrastructure and the particular management requirements of a large-scale mutant army. The Vault Dweller moved through its layers, From the congregation of ordinary people who had been drawn to the cathedral's community of belonging, down through the increasingly secured levels where the master's actual operations took place, to the lowest level where the being at the center of everything held court in the ruins of a library. That descent was a geographical education in how power organizes itself, how the public face of an institution relates to its private operations, how much distance there can be between what an organization presents to the world and what it actually does. For the chosen one, the geography of Fallout 2's world carried different lessons. Modoc, the farming settlement struggling with drought and disease, and the particular challenges of trying to cultivate crops and soil that the war had left complicated, offered an early encounter with the most basic form of post-war survival, the attempt to grow food. The chosen one could help Modoc with its problems, or ignore them, could become invested in the community's survival, or simply pass through it on the way to something else. That choice said something about what kind of hero was being assembled in the decisions made across the game's first act, something that would echo forward into the larger confrontations the story was building toward. New Reno was perhaps the most tonally distinctive location in the entire Fallout series, a city built around vice and the particular social arrangements that develop when vice is managed by organized crime rather than regulated by governments. The crime families that controlled New Reno, the Bishops, the Mordinos, the Wrights, the Salvatoris, each represented a different model of criminal organization, a different relationship between violence and commerce, a different theory of how power should be maintained in a place with no law enforcement and no government accountability. The Chosen One moved through all of them, making alliances and enemies, and the city's layered corruption was both an obstacle and an education. New Reno was what happened when human beings were left to organize themselves entirely around immediate self-interest and the threat of force. It was not the worst thing the wasteland had produced, but it was not the best thing it was capable of either. Vault City, in its pristine self-containment, offered the Chosen One a different kind of lesson, a lesson about what isolation preserved and what it prevented. The Vault City residents had everything that the wasteland's other communities lacked: clean water, functioning medical technology, organized governance, security. They had maintained the pre-war technology that made those things possible through careful management and strict entrance requirements. But the cost of that maintenance was a particular kind of rigidity, a difficulty in adapting to circumstances that hadn't been anticipated by the original vault design, and a relationship with the wasteland around them that ranged from indifferent to actively exploitative. Vault City was a window into a possible future for the Fallout world, the future in which survival was achieved by restricting it to those who met specific criteria, and the Chosen One's encounters with it raised questions that the game allowed players to answer through their choices. The Lone Wanderer's capital wasteland was in many ways the most symbolically loaded geography in the series. Moving through the ruins of Washington, D.C. meant moving through the physical remains of the country that had produced the war, the monuments to its founding ideals, the government buildings where its decisions had been made, the streets that had been the address of its most powerful institutions. The Lincoln Memorial, where escaped slaves had once found sanctuary in a city divided, was occupied in the game's present by a community of freed ghouls and a figure dedicated to abolition, a continuity of theme across 2 centuries of changed circumstances. The Washington Monument, its obelisk still pointing at a sky that remembered nothing of the convictions that had built it, served as a radio antenna for the local Brotherhood chapter. The Jefferson Memorial, where the Lone Wanderer had been born, was the site of the scientific project that would define their story's conclusion. All of this geography was also history, and the Lone Wanderer moved through both simultaneously. Rivet City occupied a particular place in that geography. An aircraft carrier permanently docked at the bridge where the Anacostia and Potomac rivers met, converted over decades of settlement into something that functioned as the capital wasteland's most developed urban community. Scientists, Merchants, security personnel, and ordinary residents coexisted in the carrier's cramped corridors, maintaining a level of organized social complexity that most of the wasteland lacked. The lone wanderer encountered researchers there who were continuing the work of Project Purity in James's absence, and the quality of what they had built, imperfect, sometimes fractious, but genuinely functional, served as evidence that the wasteland's human beings were capable of more than survival arrangements. For the courier, the Mojave's geography was organized around the central corridor of Highway 95, the road that ran south from the Nevada high desert through the Mojave toward New Vegas. The towns along that road, Primm, Boulder City, Novak, Boulder City again, and then the strip's outer approach, were a kind of gauntlet, each one presenting its own situation, its own balance of threat and opportunity, its own cast of people who had organized their lives around whatever the highway's traffic could provide. The courier learned the Mojave by walking that road from one end to the other, and then departing from it into the various territories that surrounded it. The NCR controlled areas to the south and west, Caesar's legion's presence to the east, the independent settlements scattered across the desert that had managed to carve out their own arrangements with the larger powers. The Strip itself was the courier's most complicated geographical encounter. New Vegas existed in a state of remarkable preservation by wasteland standards. The casinos still lit, the streets still cleaned by Securitron patrols, the services still running in at least a functional approximation of what they had been before the war. Moving through it, the courier encountered a kind of concentrated human activity that the rest of the wasteland rarely offered. Gambling, entertainment, commerce, the particular social texture of a place where people came to spend money and leave problems behind. Underneath all of it was the infrastructure that Mr. House had maintained across 2 centuries, the system of maintenance robots and automated repair protocols that had kept the Strip functional while the rest of the country collapsed around it. The Strip was what the future looked like if someone with House's resources and House's patience decided to preserve a piece of the pre-war world as an argument for a particular kind of post-war management. The sole survivor's commonwealth was a geography of interrupted ambitions. Every settlement in the map area had been built by people who had come to the region looking for something: safety, community, resources, the specific post-war version of starting over, and had found that the Commonwealth's particular combination of factors made every ambition more difficult than it should have been. The Institute's influence was one of those factors. The anxiety about sense, about which people around you might be synthetic replacements for real individuals, had created a social climate of suspicion that made the kind of trust necessary for genuine community development more difficult to establish and maintain. The sole survivor moved through a landscape haunted by that anxiety and by the quieter hauntings of the pre-war world. The overpasses and shopping centers and suburban streets that preserved the shape of the old world while being thoroughly incapable of serving its original purposes. Diamond City, built inside the green monster of Fenway Park, was the Commonwealth's most successful attempt at organized community. The baseball diamond had become a market. The outfield had become a residential neighborhood. The walls of the stadium provided protection that no ordinary settlement could match, and the population of several hundred that Diamond City sustained was large enough to develop the full range of social complexity: politics, commerce, journalism, individual ambition, and collective frustration that made it feel like a genuine place rather than a survival arrangement. The sole survivor's encounters there, with the mayor and the market traders and Piper Wright and all the others who had made Diamond City their address, were encounters with the particular quality of a community that had made a choice to exist and was living with the consequences of that choice every day. Part 10. The Enemies They Changed. The antagonists of the Fallout series are not, on the whole, simply enemies. They are mirrors. Each of the major figures who oppose the Fallout protagonists carried within their opposition a reflection of something real about the world and about the protagonists themselves. A distorted version of ambitions that the heroes also pursued, or a coherent alternative to choices that the heroes had made, or a genuine argument for a different way of organizing the wasteland's future that the protagonists had to engage with rather than simply dismiss. The Master, as the Vault Dweller's primary antagonist, was carrying an argument about human inadequacy that was not entirely wrong. He had watched human beings make the choices that ended the world. He had concluded, through a process of reasoning that began in genuine intelligence and ended in a kind of desperate certainty, that the problem was biological. The unity was not a plan built from hatred. It was a plan built from a particular kind of love, love for the idea of life, for the possibility of a species that could survive what human beings had done to themselves, for a future that didn't contain the same failures as the present. The fact that the plan was wrong, that the biological solution was not a solution at all, that the supermutant's sterility made the Unity's vision literally impossible, doesn't change the quality of the reasoning that had produced it. The Master was an intelligent being who had reasoned himself into a terrible mistake, and when the mistake was demonstrated to him clearly, he was honest enough to recognize it. The Enclave, as the antagonist of both the Chosen One and the Lone Wanderer's stories, was carrying something harder to rehabilitate. The Enclave's self-conception as the legitimate continuation of the United States government, as the entity with the constitutional right to govern what remained of the country and the biological right to decide who qualified as a citizen of it, was built on foundations that didn't survive contact with the wasteland's reality. The people who had continued outside the vaults and the Enclave's oil rig were not genetically compromised in any meaningful sense. They were human beings who had survived extraordinary circumstances and had built lives and communities in the aftermath. The Enclave's inability or unwillingness to recognize that was not a logical failure. It was a moral one, and the difference matters. Frank Horrigan, the cybernetically enhanced super soldier who served as the Enclave's enforcer in Fallout 2, was a different kind of antagonist from the Enclave's leadership. He was not, in any meaningful sense, pursuing an ideological vision. He was a product, a soldier who had been enhanced beyond anything his pre-war counterpart could have imagined, serving an organization with complete commitment because commitment to the organization was the only identity he had been left with. The Chosen One's encounter with Horrigan was, in this reading, less a confrontation with evil than a confrontation with what happens to a person when their individual humanity has been systematically replaced by institutional function. That is its own kind of tragedy, quieter than the Master's, but no less complete. Caesar, the legion leader who opposed the courier's interests in the Mojave, was perhaps the most genuinely complex antagonist in the series. Edward Sallow had been, before he became Caesar, an anthropologist, someone whose professional training had been devoted to understanding how societies worked, how cultures organized themselves, what made civilizations survive or collapse. He had applied that training to the wasteland with genuine intellectual rigor and had arrived at conclusions that were deeply troubling, but not incoherent. The NCR was failing by the metrics that mattered for long-term civilizational survival: overextended, corrupt, unable to enforce its standards across its own territory. The Legion, with its brutal discipline and its total commitment to the project of its own expansion, was genuinely more effective at the specific task of maintaining social cohesion and military discipline. It was monstrous, but it worked. The courier who engaged with Caesar on this level, who was willing to understand his argument rather than simply oppose it, encountered something that most of the Fallout series' other protagonists did not face: an antagonist whose worldview had been developed with genuine intelligence applied to genuinely real problems. The Legion was wrong in the end about what the wasteland needed and about the cost that the wasteland's people should be required to pay for stability. But it was wrong in a way that required engagement rather than simple rejection, and the courier who engaged with it was changed by the encounter in ways that the courier who simply destroyed it was not. The Institute, as the sole survivor's primary antagonist, was the Fallout series' most ambivalent villain. The organization's leadership was not composed of monsters. Many of them were genuinely committed to the project of human advancement, to the development of technologies that would, in some future that they believed in completely, allow civilization to be rebuilt at a scale and quality that the current wasteland could not support. The synths they were producing were the instruments of that project, developed through a series of iterations that each brought them closer to the biological realism that the scientists believed would eventually produce something genuinely new. The ethical horror at the center of the Institute's operation, the casual replacement of people in the Commonwealth with synthetic versions, the indifference to the lives displaced by that process, was not the product of malice. It was the product of a research culture that had been operating in isolation for so long that it had lost the capacity to register the Commonwealth's people as fully real. Father, the sole survivor's son, grown old in the Institute's corridors, was the most personally painful version of this. He had been shaped by an organization that had never taught him to weigh its activities against the costs borne by the people outside the walls. He had become excellent at being what the Institute needed him to be, and in the process had become genuinely unable to be the son that the sole survivor had been frozen into the hope of finding. The reunion at the end of the Institute's questline was one of the most uncomfortable moments in the series, not because it was cruel, but because it was sad in the specific way that estrangements are sad. The way lost time is sad. The way people are sad who have become so thoroughly who they are that they can no longer be who they were supposed to be. The Scorch Beasts, as the Vault 76 residents' primary natural antagonist, were a different kind of enemy from all of these. Not intelligent, not ideologically motivated, not carrying any argument that needed to be engaged with. They were ecological, a population of creatures that had developed in a particular environmental context and that posed a threat simply by being what they had become in the conditions the war had created. The horror of the scorched plague was not the horror of malice or ambition. It was the horror of consequence. The slow revelation that the war had set in motion biological processes that were continuing to develop in directions that no one had planned and no one could fully control, and that the people of Appalachia were living inside those processes whether they chose to or not. Part 11. The choices that defined them. There is a particular kind of game design philosophy embedded in the Fallout series from its first entry, a philosophy that holds that the choices a player makes should matter in ways that are genuinely consequential, that the world should respond to decisions rather than simply absorbing them, that the ending of a story should reflect the texture of the journey that produced it. Each Fallout protagonist is, in this sense, the sum of the choices made on their behalf, and what those choices collectively reveal about the person being constructed is different for each game in the series. The Vault Dweller's most significant choice was not combat-related. It was the choice to pursue understanding rather than force, the decision to investigate the Master's plan deeply enough to find the flaw in it, and to bring that flaw to the Master's attention rather than simply fighting through to a violent resolution. That choice required both the capability to survive long enough to gather the necessary information and the wisdom to recognize, when the information had been gathered, that it represented an opportunity for a different kind of ending. The Vault Dweller who made that choice was a person of particular quality, and the fact that the game offered it as a genuine option said something about what the designers believed players were capable of and about what they believed the Wasteland's problems ultimately required. The Chosen One's most significant choices were about what to do with power once it was obtained. The game offered the Chosen One the option to become genuinely overwhelming, to accumulate capabilities far beyond what any ordinary wasteland resident could develop, to become the kind of figure that settlements built legends around. The question that capability raised was not whether the chosen one could do something, but whether they should. The ability to talk enemies into surrendering, to use the social skills that the game's design made available, was always available alongside the ability to simply destroy them. Choosing the former over the latter repeatedly across the full length of the game was the choice that produced the hero the village of Arroyo remembered when the story was over. The lone wanderer's most significant choices were about who was worth protecting and what that protection cost. The companions they chose to travel with, the settlements they chose to defend or ignore, the decision about whether to complete Project Purity in the way that James had originally envisioned it. All of these were choices about the scope of the hero's responsibility. How far did the obligation to use power well extend? Did it stop at the vault that had produced the lone wanderer? At the Brotherhood chapter that had given them rank and resources? At the capital wasteland as a geography? Or did it extend, as James had believed, to everyone who needed clean water, whether or not they had any way of thanking the person who provided it? The courier's most significant choices were explicitly political. The four-way conflict between the NCR, the Legion, Mr. House, and the independent option was a genuine ideological contest that the game took seriously enough to make each faction's arguments available in full before asking the courier to decide. The NCR's democratic imperfection versus the Legion's totalitarian effectiveness. Mr. House's technocratic management versus the democratic messiness of independent governance. There were no choices in Fallout New Vegas that were purely strategic. Every major decision carried a theory of the future embedded in it, a belief about what the Mojave needed and what the people who lived there deserved. The courier who chose carefully, who chose with awareness of what each choice meant for the specific people who would live with its consequences, was a courier defined by political wisdom rather than simply by capability. The sole survivor's most significant choices were about family and faction, and the question of whether those two things could be reconciled. Finding Sean, that was the driving urgency of the whole story, turned out to require choosing what to do about the institute that had raised him, and that choice was also a choice about what the Commonwealth should become. Destroy the institute, and you destroyed the most advanced technology the region had access to, but you also removed the source of the anxiety about synths that had made genuine community trust so difficult. Side with the institute, and you committed to preserving an organization that had been operating without accountability for decades, regardless of its eventual potential. Side with the Brotherhood, and you aligned with an organization whose methods were often effective, but whose ideology had serious limitations. Side with the Minutemen, and you chose the slowest and most uncertain path, but also the one most consistent with genuine respect for the Commonwealth's people. None of these were clean choices. They were all trades, all compromises, all decisions that bought something at the cost of something else. The Vault 76 residents' most significant choices were about what the emerging community of Appalachia should look like, what values should organize it, what the relationship between security and liberty should be, how the inevitable tensions between different groups of survivors should be navigated. These choices played out through a series of faction conflicts and community decisions that the multiplayer format had distributed across multiple players' choices, making the residents' individual decisions always part of a larger collective negotiation. The resulting community of Appalachia was not the product of any single vision, but of many overlapping ones, a genuinely collaborative construction that no single protagonist's choices could have produced alone. Part 12, The Legacy in the Lore. The Fallout series has, over the decades since the first game was released, built up a body of lore that connects these protagonist stories to each other and to the wider history of the universe. That lore exists in many forms, in the terminals and holotapes that the games scatter through their environments, in the dialogue of characters who have lived through or heard about the events of earlier entries, In the documents and records that the games present as the historical record of a world that has been keeping track of its own history even through catastrophe. The Vault Dweller's legacy in the lore exists most immediately in the figure of the Chosen One, in the fact that Arroyo was built, that the village formed, that the tradition of the trial of the temple emerged from the community that Albert Cole helped create. Everything that the Chosen One accomplished was made possible by the Vault Dweller's exile, which was made possible by the Vault Dweller's success, which was made possible by the particular combination of capabilities that a 19-year-old from Vault 13 had carried outward into a 100-year-old wasteland. The causal chain is long and improbable, and the world of the Fallout series depends on every link in it. The Chosen One's legacy in the lore is harder to trace in later games, but present in the broader shape of California's post-war political development. The enclave that the Chosen One defeated was not entirely destroyed. Remnants persisted, relocated, continued operating in diminished form. Some of those remnants eventually found their way to the East Coast, where the lone wanderer would encounter them decades later. The destruction of the Enclave's oil rig did not end the organization. It ended a particular chapter of it, and the chapters that followed were shaped by the loss of the organization's pre-war infrastructure and the adaptation required by that loss. The Lone Wanderer's legacy in the lore is perhaps the most structurally important of any protagonist, given that it directly shaped the organization, the Commonwealth Brotherhood of Steel, that plays a central role in the setting of the next mainline game. The Prydwen and its crew, Elder Maxon and his convictions, the particular quality of the Brotherhood that arrived in the Commonwealth, all of it has its roots in what happened in the capital wasteland after Project Purity. The Lone Wanderer's story ended the Enclave's presence in the East. It activated Project Purity. It elevated someone to a rank within the Brotherhood that gave them the influence to shape what the Brotherhood subsequently became. The Lone Wanderer may have been erased from the Brotherhood's official records, but the organization they helped build is walking evidence of their presence. The Courier's legacy in the lore is confirmed by the Fallout television series' inclusion of Mr. House as a living figure. House's survival past the events of New Vegas required the specific outcome of the Battle of Hoover Dam that the Courier's choices produced, required that the Courier had delivered the chip, activated the Securitrons, and given House's forces the capacity to assert New Vegas's independence against both the NCR and the Legion. The show's producers made a decision, by including House, to confirm that the Courier had made that particular sequence of choices. The Mojave that exists in the Fallout universe's confirmed timeline is the Mojave that the Courier shaped, and that means the Courier's choices are part of the canon that all subsequent Fallout stories build upon. The sole survivor's legacy in the lore is similarly confirmed by the television series, which establishes that the Commonwealth Brotherhood remained active and that its airship survived the events of Fallout 4. That survival required an ending in which the Prydwen was not destroyed, which in turn required either the Brotherhood ending or the Minutemen ending, both of which left the airship intact. The sole survivor who exists in the Fallout universe's confirmed timeline is the one who made choices consistent with those outcomes, who aligned with the Brotherhood long enough to use their resources against the Institute, and who left the organization's main military asset intact in the aftermath. The Vault 76 resident's legacy in the lore is, as discussed earlier, most notable for its absence. The gap between Fallout 76 and the later entries in the series represents 200 years of history that the lore has not fully explained, and the theories about what happened in that gap all involve the resident and their community as the primary agents of whatever occurred, whether they preserved Appalachia through successful management or sacrificed it to contain a threat that had grown beyond management. That question will presumably be answered at some point, and when it is, the Vault 76 resident will move from the most uncertain legacy in the series to one of the most dramatic. Part 13. The Overseer and the Outcast. There is a recurring structure in the Fallout series that deserves its own attention. Almost every mainline Fallout game begins with an expulsion, a moment in which the protagonist is sent outward from the enclosed safety of wherever they have been into the larger world that the story will take place in. The Vault Dweller was exiled from Vault 13. The Chosen One was sent outward by the village elder. The Lone Wanderer was expelled from Vault 101. The Sole Survivor was ejected from Vault 111 by the simple passage of time and the reopening of a cryogenic pod. The Courier was effectively expelled from the comfortable assumption of ordinary professional life by a bullet. This structure is not accidental. It reflects something real about how the Fallout universe understands the relationship between safety and growth, about what the vaults represent and what the wasteland represents, and what happens to a person who has to navigate the transition between them. The vault is not simply a location in these stories. It is a psychological condition, a state of managed safety, of limited knowledge, of protection from the consequences of the larger world. Being expelled from it by an overseer's decree, by a dying community's desperation, by a gunshot in the desert, is the moment at which the story of a Fallout protagonist actually begins. The overseers who appear in the Fallout series are themselves worth considering as a category. They are figures of authority in a very specific context, the authority of someone responsible for the survival of an enclosed community, operating under constraints that most other forms of authority do not face. The overseer of Vault 13, who exiled the Vault Dweller, was wrong to do it. But he was wrong in the way that frightened people with real responsibility sometimes are, making a choice that protected the short-term stability of the community at the cost of the long-term perspective that the community needed to develop. The overseer of Vault 101, who expelled the Lone Wanderer, was wrong more completely, acting from a panic that had no rational basis beyond the fear of change. But the result was the same: a protagonist released into the world at the moment when the world needed them. The Vault 76 residents' relationship with their overseer was different from any previous protagonists. The overseer of Vault 76 had left the vault before the residents in deliberate violation of her own position's protocols because she had concluded that the wasteland's needs were more urgent than the vault's orderly transition process. She left behind a trail of notes and resources rather than a set of commands, trusting the residents to find them and use them rather than waiting to receive orders. This inversion of the usual overseer dynamic, the authority figure walking out first, leaving the community to follow on their own terms, said something about the particular kind of relationship between safety and agency that the game was trying to model. The Vault 76 residents were not expelled. They were invited. The door was opened, and the invitation was extended, and what happened next was genuinely up to them. The difference between expulsion and invitation is not trivial. The Vault Dweller and the Lone Wanderer were pushed out into situations they had not chosen, carrying disadvantages that the circumstances of their exit had imposed on them. The Vault 76 resident walked out with the full preparation that Vault 76's control vault population had been given, educated, capable, informed in ways that most vault residents were not about the world they were entering. The expulsion model produces protagonists shaped by the experience of having been rejected, carrying a particular quality of self-reliance born from the knowledge that the institution that was supposed to protect them had chosen not to. The invitation model produces something different: protagonists shaped by the experience of being trusted, of having been given resources, and then asked to use them wisely in the world's service. Both models produce heroes, but they produce heroes with different relationships to the concept of home, different answers to the question of what it means to return to a place that did or did not choose to keep you, different relationships to the institutions that shaped the early chapters of their lives and then released them into the world's uncertainty. Part 14. The Nights in the Wasteland. There is a quality to the Fallout series depiction of night that deserves its own attention in any discussion of what the games feel like from the inside. The wasteland after dark is a different place from the wasteland in daylight, quieter in some ways, but also more alive to a different set of threats and a different set of opportunities. The creatures that preferred darkness moved more freely. The settlements reduced their activity to whatever could be managed inside their perimeters. The fires that burned in the ruins of cities and towns gave off a light that was warm and particular, the light of things that had been found and repurposed rather than the light of things that had been built for the purpose of illuminating. The vault dweller spent nights in the wasteland, sheltering wherever cover presented itself. The ruins of buildings that had been standing for a century since the bombs, the geological features of the California desert, the occasional settlement that was willing to extend some form of hospitality to a stranger passing through, with equipment that suggested they might be worth trading with. Those nights in the wasteland were not simply rest. They were time in which the accumulated experience of the day settled into something usable, the knowledge of a safe path, the memory of a conversation that had revealed information, the awareness of a threat that needed to be navigated differently tomorrow than it had been navigated today. The Chosen One moved through Fallout 2's longer days and longer distances with a similar relationship to the wasteland's rhythms. The journey from Arroyo to the various locations of Northern California was genuinely long by the standards of the series, longer than the Vault Dweller's journey in terms of the geographic scale represented on the game's map. And the nights spent crossing that distance were full of the specific quality of being far from anything familiar and not yet arrived at the next place on the route. There is a particular kind of alertness that belongs to those in-between nights, a heightened attention to the surroundings that keeps the mind occupied when there is nothing to do but continue moving and nothing to worry about but everything. The lone wanderer's nights in the capital wasteland were marked by the specific ambient quality of a ruined city, the sounds of a damaged urban environment persisting through the dark, the particular echo of empty streets and broken windows, the light of fires visible at distances that the wasteland's flat terrain allowed. Washington, D.C. at night was a different kind of lonely from the loneliness of the California desert or the Nevada high country. It was the loneliness of a place that had been built for millions of people and now housed tens of thousands, the loneliness of scale, of infrastructure designed for a population density that no longer existed, of spaces whose proportions kept implying a presence that was no longer there to fill them. The courier's nights in the Mojave carried the desert's particular quality of extreme temperature contrast. The days of the Nevada high desert were hot enough to be a genuine physiological challenge, the kind of heat that required managing water intake and activity levels. The nights that followed were cold in the way that high desert nights are cold. Quickly, completely, the heat of the day departing with a speed that surprised people who associated Nevada with warmth. The fires that burned outside the wasteland settlements on those cold nights were gathering points, places where the evening social activity concentrated around the management of warmth. And the courier who stopped at those fires was stopping at something that had organized human social behavior since before recorded history. The sole survivors' nights in the Commonwealth were colored by the specific atmosphere of a region that had been densely populated before the war and remained relatively dense after it by the standards of the wasteland. There were more fires visible at night in the Commonwealth than in most of the other regions the series had depicted, more settlements closer together, more evidence of the ongoing human project of maintaining warmth and light against the dark. But there was also the particular quality of a region under a persistent threat, where the night brought both the comfort of fire and the anxiety of what might be drawn to it. The sole survivor who sat by a settlement fire at night was sitting with both the warmth and the awareness that the warmth was visible from a distance. The Vault 76 residents' nights in Appalachia were the most geographically varied in the series. The region's mountains and forests produced a different quality of darkness than the flat deserts and ruined cities of the other games, a darkness shaped by terrain and canopy. broken by the light sources that the region's more intact ecology supported. Bioluminescent fungi in the caverns, the amber light of the fireflies, insects that had survived the ecological disruption of 2 centuries and continued their ancient practice of signaling in the dark. The fires of the few remaining settlements burning against the Appalachian chill that descended from the mountains each evening. The Vault 76 resident moved through this darkness with the awareness that it was older than any of the human stories being told within it, that the mountains had been there before the war and would be there after any of the current arrangements had run their course. Part 15. What They Left Behind. Every Fallout protagonist left something behind, not metaphorically, though they all left metaphorical things behind as well, but concretely, physically in the lore of the universe that the series has built across nearly 3 decades, things that can be pointed to that exist in the history of the wasteland as the evidence of a particular person's particular actions. The Vault Dweller left Arroyo. The settlement still exists in the game's timeline at the opening of Fallout 2, inhabited and functional and organized around the cultural memory of the person who helped establish it. It is a modest legacy in geographic terms, a village, not a city, but it is a genuine one. The people of Arroyo exist because Albert Cole walked north after his exile and found a place where the land could support them. Their existence across 2 or 3 generations by the time the Chosen One's story begins is a direct consequence of one person's decision to keep going after everything had apparently ended. The Chosen One left a repaired Garden of Eden creation kit active in the soil of the Arroyo region. Whatever that device produced in the years after the game ended, whatever agricultural recovery it enabled, whatever expansion of the settlement's capacity to support life it allowed, was the direct product of the mission the Chosen One completed. There are also the various settlements across the California wasteland that the game's good endings describe being improved, stabilized, or reconnected to wider trade networks through the Chosen One's activities. These are the diffuse legacy of someone who moved through a large and complicated world, making choices that improved specific situations without necessarily transforming the entire landscape. The Lone Wanderer left Project Purity, the treatment facility in the Jefferson Memorial, the infrastructure that James had designed and the Lone Wanderer had completed, continued operating in the years after the game's conclusion, producing clean water for the capital wasteland in quantities that the region's pre-purity infrastructure had been unable to supply. The Brotherhood had taken over management of the distribution, extending the network of pumps and pipes that carried the water outward. The Lone Wanderer's role in that ongoing operation was invisible by the time of Fallout 4, their contribution absorbed into the Brotherhood's institutional narrative. But the water was still there, still clean, still reaching communities that would have been managing drought without it. The Courier left New Vegas intact. In the canonical timeline, the city survived the Battle of Hoover Dam as an independent entity. Not NCR territory, not Legion territory, but the particular arrangement that Mr. House had been planning since before the war. The lights still burned, the Securitrons still patrolled, the Strip still operated in its concentrated, morally complex way. Whether the Courier considered this a personal achievement or simply the most interesting outcome of a job that had expanded well beyond its original scope depends on who the player had made the Courier into. But the result was the same. A city that had been hanging in the balance between 3 competing powers was still there, still lit, still functioning as the most visible evidence of what a particular kind of preservation could produce. The sole survivor left the beginning of a reconnected Commonwealth, the Minutemen restored to something approaching functional operation, the settlements they protected, beginning to develop the relationships with each other that could eventually produce something more durable than individual survival arrangements. The Institute's technology, or at least the question of what to do with it, resolved in a way that the Commonwealth's communities could begin to recover from. The Brotherhood's presence in the region, depending on the ending, either as a continuing protective force or as a diminished one, but in either case, no longer the dominant threat it had been during the period of active conflict. The sole survivor left a commonwealth that was different from the one they had woken up in ways that the people living there would be dealing with for generations. The Vault 76 resident left something that exists only in the absence of records. Whatever they built in Appalachia in the 2 centuries before Fallout 3's timeline, whatever settlement, whatever community, whatever organization had grown from the combination of Vault 76's trained population and the cleared threat of the Scorched Plague, is not in the lore. Either it is waiting to be discovered in a future game's archaeology, or it ended in some way that the theories have been trying to explain. In either case, the Vault 76 resident left something behind that the wasteland has not yet finished deciding how to remember. Slow passage, the long rest. The stories have been told now. Not completely. They could never be told completely because the Fallout universe has always been richer than any single account of it. And the spaces between what is documented and what can be imagined are where much of its most interesting life takes place. But the shape of them has been drawn. A line of figures stretching from 1997 to the present, each one carrying the world's problems forward until they could be set down or transformed into something lighter. There is no hurry in what remains. The accounts have been given their full measure. The protagonists have been introduced. Their stories have been followed to their various conclusions. Their legacies have been traced through the lore that the series has built around them. Now it is time simply to sit with what has been described, to let the images settle, to let the details find their places in whatever architecture the mind builds for the things it has been told. The wasteland is quiet this time of night. The Mojave cools in the hours after midnight to a temperature that makes sleep genuinely possible, the rocks releasing the heat they absorb during the day, slowly. Over the course of hours, the desert returning to something like neutrality before the sun comes back to begin the cycle again. The fires of Good Springs burn low this late. Doc Mitchell's house is dark, as it was before the courier arrived, and as it will be again when the courier's story is over. The desert does not mark the passage of its stories the way cities do. It simply continues, patient and enormous, indifferent to the heroism that is played out across its surface in ways that suggest the heroism mattered, but do not require it to have done so. The Appalachian Mountains are older than any of the stories the Fallout series tells about them. They were old when the pre-war country was young, and they were old when the bombs fell, and they will be old when the last of the Vault 76 residents' decisions has worked its way through the consequences it set in motion. The rivers still run through their valleys. The forests still hold the particular quality of forested highlands, a density and darkness that the flat regions of the map cannot produce, a sense of scale provided by the vertical dimension of the terrain rather than the horizontal dimension of the distance. Something lives there that has been living there since before any human being had a reason to build a vault, and it will continue living there after the last vault has been either opened or sealed for good. The capital wasteland breathes at night with the particular rhythm of a ruined city, slowly, heavily, the weight of its own history pressing down in ways that open spaces do not produce. The monuments catch the moonlight in the way that monuments are built to catch light. Their surface is designed to be impressive at any hour and in any weather. The Potomac moves through the dark with the same indifference it has always shown to the events on its banks, carrying the evidence of everything that has happened to it, while bearing no particular opinion about any of it. The treatment systems at the Jefferson Memorial continue their work through the night, as they have continued it for years, converting the river's content into something drinkable in the slow, patient way that infrastructure works when it is maintained by people who understand both how to maintain it and why the maintenance matters. Let those images rest here. Let the vault dweller's folded suit rest on its bed at the edge of an empty room, in a village that will carry the memory of the person who left it there for as long as the village exists. Let the chosen one's name rest in the stories that Arroyo tells about the figure who came back from the outside world, carrying the device that saved the crops, in the gentle mythology that small communities build around their most memorable members. Let the warrior's accomplishments rest in the quiet of the Midwest, in whatever form those accomplishments currently take. The brotherhood chapters they helped establish, the communities they helped defend, the particular arrangement of power and protection that their leadership style made possible. Let the lone wanderer's name rest in the gap where it should appear in the Brotherhood's records, but does not, in the silence that is either an erasure or a deliberate privacy, depending on what you believe happened in the years after Project Purity. Let the courier's legacy rest in the lights of New Vegas, still burning against the desert dark, the most visible evidence of a choice made by someone who had been shot in the head and left for dead, and had chosen on waking to continue anyway. Let the sole survivor's work rest in the settlements of the Commonwealth, in the Minutemen patrols that connect them, in the slow rebuilding of trust between communities that had spent decades too frightened to trust each other with anything that mattered. Let the Vault 76 resident rest in the unwritten pages of the history that the wasteland will eventually have to account for, in the 200 years of Appalachian quiet that no Fallout game has yet entered, in whatever it was they built and whatever it cost them to protect it. These are the stories. Not complete, not perfect, not free from the particular limitations of any attempt to account for a fictional universe that has been built across decades by hundreds of contributors with their own visions of what it should be. But honest about the beauty and the cost of the thing being described, about the heroism and the loneliness and the gaps between the two, about what it meant to be a Fallout protagonist, to be the person the wasteland handed the hardest problems and waited to see what would happen. What happened over and over in game after game across nearly 30 years of the series' existence was that the person handed the hardest problems kept going. That is the summary. That is the through line. The form kept going. Not because it was easy, not because it was rewarded immediately or completely, not because the wasteland was kind about the cost it extracted, but because stopping was worse than continuing, and because somewhere in the logic of the wasteland's design was the implicit promise that continuing was worth it. The night is far enough along now that the distinction between remaining awake and beginning to drift has become soft and negotiable. The images from the stories told tonight are still there. The folded vault suit, the lights of the Strip, the Jefferson Memorial beside its river, but they have taken on the particular quality of things seen from a distance, things that have been carried to the edge of consciousness and can now be set down gently without being lost. Set them down, let the wasteland quiet, let the fires burn down to their embers as they do every night, as they have done every night for 2 centuries in every region of the Fallout universe, burning their quiet evidence of continued human habitation against the dark. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.